She showed up to their first date soaking wet, covered in mud, missing both shoes, and he almost walked out on her. He didn't know she had just pulled a drowning child out of a flash-flooded drainage canal with her bare hands. He didn't know she was worth $3 billion. He didn't know she was about to become the most important person in his life. Landon Hayes had spent 5 years surviving. What he hadn't done, not once, was let himself hope for something more. That was about to change on the worst first date either of them had ever had. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain started around 4:30 in the afternoon, the kind that came without warning and turned Seattle's streets into shallow rivers within 20 minutes. Landon Hayes sat in the window booth of a cafe called The Anchor, watching the gutters overflow and trying to remember the last time he'd done something this stupid. Blind dates. He was 32 years old, a father, a man who paid his own bills and packed his daughter's lunch every morning and hadn't once complained about the monotony of it. He didn't need this. He told his sister as much, twice, when she'd first brought it up 3 weeks ago. "You need to get out of the house," Renata had said, leaning against his kitchen counter with that expression she always wore when she'd already decided something. "You need to talk to an adult who isn't a coworker or a soccer coach." "I talk to adults. Mia's teacher doesn't count." "I have conversations." "Landon." She'd set her coffee mug down. "You fell asleep at 9:15 on New Year's Eve. You had the same haircut for 4 years. The last movie you watched in a theater was animated." He hadn't had a good answer for that. The animated movie had been good, for the record. So here he was. The Anchor, a place with exposed brick and overpriced coffee and jazz playing just loud enough to make you feel like you'd made an effort. He'd arrived 8 minutes early, which had given him time to feel increasingly foolish in a booth meant for two. He'd ordered a water, then felt weird about only ordering water, so he'd ordered a coffee, and now he had both in front of him and his hands didn't know what to do with themselves. Her name was Sienna. That was all Renata had told him, which was either thoughtful or sadistic depending on how the next hour went. "She's brilliant," Renata had said. "She's kind. She's had a rough few months. Just be yourself." What does that mean, rough few months? It means she's a real person with real problems, which should be refreshing compared to the woman you were with. That had ended the conversation. Landon didn't talk about his ex-wife, not with Renata, not with anyone. He checked his phone. 6:02. She was 2 minutes late, which was nothing, which was fine. He looked out the window again at the rain. That's when he saw her. She was crossing the street at the intersection half a block down, and the first thing he noticed was that she wasn't walking normally. She was moving fast, almost lurching, and her arms were wrapped around herself. Her hair was completely drenched, dark and plastered flat against her skull. Her jacket, some kind of blazer that had probably been expensive before tonight, was soaked through and had something dark smeared across the front of it. Mud, he'd think later. At the time, he just thought blood. She wasn't wearing shoes. He watched her push open the door to the Anchor, and the little bell above it chimed, and she stepped inside and stood there for a second in the entrance while everyone in the cafe paused and looked at her. She looked like someone who had been in an accident. She looked like someone the night had chewed up and spat back out. Her eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on him, on the lone man sitting in a booth for two, something shifted in her face. Not embarrassment exactly, more like someone who knew they owed an explanation and wasn't sure where to begin. She walked over. She was tall. He registered that first, then the fact that her feet were bare against the hardwood floor, leaving small wet prints with each step. Up close, the mud on her jacket was definitely mud, streaked from her collar down to her waist, with a long diagonal tear near the hem. There was a scratch on her forearm that looked fresh. Her mascara, what was left of it, had tracked down both cheeks in thin gray lines. She stopped at the edge of his table. "Landon?" she said. Her voice was steady. That surprised him. "Yeah," he said. "I'm Sienna." She didn't offer her hand, maybe because both of them were still visibly shaking. "I realize I look like I lost a fight with a storm drain. I did, sort of. I have a lot to explain, and I completely understand if you want to reschedule." He stared at her for a moment. "The honest thing," The thing he didn't say out loud was that his first impulse was exactly that: reschedule, or just end it here politely and drive home to his daughter and his quiet apartment and his 9:15 bedtime. This woman looked like chaos. He'd had enough chaos to last a decade. He didn't need more. But there was something in the way she was standing there, soaked and barefoot and somehow not humiliated, that made him hesitate. "Sit down," he said instead. She slid into the booth across from him. A server materialized almost immediately, a young woman who looked uncertain whether to hand Sienna a menu or a first aid kit, and Sienna asked for a cup of hot tea and a towel, if there was one. The server disappeared. Sienna pressed her palms flat against the table like she was steadying herself, and took a breath. "There was a kid," she said, "in the drainage canal on 5th, near the overpass, the one that's been flooding all week." She wasn't looking at him now. She was looking at the table. "I was in a car, coming from the office. My driver called it out. There was a crowd on the sidewalk, everyone standing around, and I could see something in the water. A kid. Maybe 5, maybe 6. He'd gone in somehow. I don't know. The current was—" She stopped. "It was fast. The water was moving fast." Landon said nothing. "I got out," she said, like this was a simple fact rather than a decision. "The canal wall isn't high on that block, maybe 4 feet. I jumped down. The mud was deeper than I expected. I lost my shoes almost immediately. But I got him. He was scared, and he'd swallowed water, but he was okay. The paramedics came." She finally looked up. His name was Oliver. That's what his mother kept saying when she got to him. "Oliver, Oliver, Oliver." She said the name quietly, like it was still in her head. Landon looked at the scratch on her forearm, which was longer than he'd initially noticed. Maybe 6 inches from elbow to wrist, shallow but angry red. "You're hurt," he said. "The wall," she said. "Coming back up. I'm fine." "You should probably get that cleaned." "I know." She didn't move to do it. The server came back with tea and, to her credit, an actual small folded towel. Sienna thanked her and pressed the towel against her arm briefly, then wrapped her hands around the tea mug. Some of the shaking in her fingers started to ease. "I know this is not the first impression anyone plans for," she said. "If you want to leave, genuinely, I won't take it personally. Tonight has been a lot." "Is that your way of telling me you want to leave?" She looked at him. "No." "Then let's just drink our drinks," he said. "You can tell me whether the jacket's salvageable or not." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face. "It's not." Was it expensive? Very. Unfortunate. "Completely worth it," she said. And that was the beginning of it, though Landon wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. At the time, it just felt like 2 people having an awkward conversation in a cafe, one of them significantly wetter than the other. The rain didn't let up. If anything, it came down harder around 7, drumming against the cafe windows and turning the street outside into something that looked more like a canal than a road. They didn't leave. Landon learned, over the next 90 minutes, that Sienna Vale was 30 years old, that she'd grown up in Portland, that she'd studied computer science, and then dropped out 18 months before finishing her degree to start a company. He learned that she liked black coffee when she wasn't freezing, and that she'd ordered the tea by mistake, reaching for something warm without thinking, and that she found this faintly annoying but didn't want to make a fuss about it. He did not learn, not that night, that the company she'd started was Vale Technology, which had become, over the last 8 years, one of the 5 largest private tech firms in the country. He did not learn that the blazer she'd ruined in a drainage canal had cost $1,100, or that the car she'd left parked on 5th with its hazard lights still blinking belonged to a fleet of 3 that she kept for business travel. He did not learn that the rough few months his sister had alluded to were actually something considerably more serious, that Sienna Vale's company was currently under threat from within, that the people she'd trusted to build something alongside her were quietly, methodically, working to take it from her. He learned none of this because Sienna didn't tell him, not because she was deceptive, but because in that cafe, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was just a person sitting across from another person, and it felt too much like breathing to interrupt it with the weight of everything else. What Landon did learn was that she asked questions the way people rarely did. like she actually wanted to know the answers. Not performance, not politeness. When he mentioned, almost in passing, that he had a daughter, she didn't do what most people did, which was offer a quick, "That's sweet," and pivot to something else. She leaned forward slightly and asked how old, and what was she like, and what did she like to do. "She's 6, Landon said. "Her name's Mia." "What's she into?" "Right now, soccer and dinosaurs. Last month it was sharks and drawing horses. Before that, for a very intense 3 weeks, it was exclusively volcanoes." Sienna laughed. Genuinely, sudden, a short burst of it that she covered quickly with one hand. "That's a specific obsession." "She has a book, Volcanoes of the Pacific Rim. She carried it to school for 2 weeks straight. Her teacher called me." He paused. Not in a bad way. The teacher was just impressed and mildly concerned. How long did it last? Until she saw a documentary about Spinosaurus. Then the volcanoes were out. Spinosaurus knocked out a volcano phase. Spinosaurus takes no prisoners. She was smiling properly now, and he noticed it changed her face considerably. Not that she'd looked unfriendly before, but the smile was different, a little crooked, like she hadn't entirely decided to let it happen, and it had gone ahead without her permission. "She sounds like a lot," Sienna said. "Every single day," he agreed. "She's the best thing I've ever done." He said it simply, without sentiment, the way you stated a fact you'd long since stopped questioning. Sienna was quiet for a moment after that. "You're raising her alone?" she asked. "Yeah." He didn't offer more than that, and she didn't push, which, again, was different from most people. "That's hard," she said. Not a question, not a consolation prize, just an acknowledgement. "It is," he said, "but it's also—" He thought about it. "It's the kind of hard that feels right, if that makes sense, like I'm not grinding through it. I'm just in it." She nodded slowly. "That makes sense." Outside, a car went through a puddle too fast and sent up a wave of water that hit the cafe window with a sound like a hand slap. They both startled, then laughed, and the tension that had been quietly threading through the conversation loosened slightly. He asked her about her work. "Tech," she'd said briefly, which told him nothing. "Software, primarily," she said. "Security infrastructure. Boring to describe, but the problems are interesting." "What kind of problems?" "Protecting systems that other people are trying to break." She wrapped both hands around her mug again. "It's adversarial in a way. You're always thinking like the person who's trying to get in, so you can figure out where you left the doors unlocked. Do you like it?" She considered the question more carefully than he expected. "I built it," she said finally. "It's not separate from me enough for me to evaluate whether I like it. It's just mine." "What does that feel like?" "Lately?" A pause. "Like a lot of responsibility and not enough sleep." "Welcome to my life." She looked at him. "Are we comparing notes on exhaustion?" "I think that might be the most honest first date conversation I've ever had." Something crossed her face again, that almost smile. "Is it a competition?" "No, it's just—" He shrugged. "Refreshing, I guess." What? He walked her out at 8:45, which was when he absolutely had to leave because Mia was with his neighbor and he'd promised to be back by 9. The rain had dropped to a drizzle, the kind that misted more than fell, and the street reflected all the cafe lights in long orange smears across the wet pavement. Sienna had been lent a pair of oversized flip-flops by the sympathetic server, purchased from a nearby convenience store in what had apparently become an entire small drama involving 3 staff members while Landon had been in the restroom. She walked in them with dignity, which he appreciated. "I owe you an apology for tonight," she said. "You don't." "I showed up looking like I'd been through something." "You had been through something." "Still." She stopped at the corner, turned to face him. Her jacket was mostly dry by now, the mud a faint, dusky stain. Her hair had dried into something almost presentable, or at least intentionally undone. The scratch on her forearm had stopped looking so raw. "I'd like to do this again under better circumstances." "What if the circumstances are always like this?" he said. She looked at him. What do you mean? I don't know. He wasn't sure where that had come from. I just mean, this wasn't bad. It was weird, but it wasn't bad. She held his gaze for a second. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He got into his car. She was still standing at the corner when he pulled out of the parking spot, looking at her phone, the mist settling over her like something that had decided to follow her home. He turned at the light, and she disappeared from his rear-view mirror. He drove home thinking about what she'd said. It's mine. The way she'd said it, not proudly, not defensively, but with a kind of weight to it, like she was carrying something too large to put down. 3 days later, she texted him. I forgot to mention, Oliver's doing fine. His mother sent a message to the paramedics and they tracked me down through the car company. Just thought you'd want to know, in case you were wondering. He hadn't been specifically wondering, but reading the message, he realized he had been in the vague background way you carry things around without naming them. That's good, he texted back. How's the jacket? A pause. Then, unsalvageable. I've been told it was a noble sacrifice. By who? My assistant. She's very dramatic. Mine keeps asking me to take more vitamin D, he typed. We have very different assistants. Your assistant sounds wise. She's my 6-year-old. She saw it on a cartoon. The reply took longer this time. When it came, that's genuinely the most charming thing I've heard all week. And I had a meeting with 37 people today. He was standing in his kitchen when he read that. Mia's backpack on the counter next to him, a half-made sandwich on the cutting board. He read it twice, set the phone face down, finished the sandwich, and then picked the phone back up and read it one more time. He asked if she wanted to get coffee on Saturday. She said yes. Lots. The second date was more orthodox. A coffee shop in Capitol Hill that Sienna knew, smaller than the Anchor, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and a dog tied to the bike rack outside, who barked at Landon and then immediately rolled onto its back, which he took as a mixed signal. She arrived on time, dressed in jeans and a gray sweater, no mud, no scratches, no wet hair. She looked different from the person he'd met in the cafe, and also exactly the same, and he wasn't sure how both things could be true simultaneously. You clean up well, he said. Very low bar, she said. I'm just saying. I'll take it. He'd thought driving over that the second meeting might expose the first as an anomaly, that without the drama and the rain and the unusual circumstances, they might find they had very little to actually say to each other. He'd been wrong. They talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and he only knew that because the barista eventually started wiping down tables with pointed efficiency. She told him more about herself, Kit. Still not the parts that mattered most, that he'd learn later, but real things. That she'd grown up with almost nothing. That her mother had worked double shifts at a hospital for most of Sienna's childhood, and that Sienna had spent a lot of evenings alone in their apartment, teaching herself things from the internet because there was nothing else to do. That the company had started as a software project she'd built on a borrowed laptop at a table in the public library before she'd had money for a desk. You bootstrapped it? Landon asked. For the first 2 years, almost entirely. I had one investor, a woman named Delphine, who I met at a conference, and she gave me $80,000 based on a 40-minute pitch, which was either very smart or completely insane on her part. Was it smart? It became smart, Sienna said. At the time, it was probably insane. What happened to her? She's on my board. A pause. She's also one of the few people at the company I actually trust right now. He caught the qualifier, and filed it away without asking. It seemed like a door that was only halfway open. He told her about himself. More than he usually would have. Something about the way she listened made it easier. He told her he'd grown up in Tacoma, that he'd studied structural engineering, that he'd worked for a construction firm for 4 years before the divorce, and then transferred within the company to something with less travel, because Mia needed consistency. That he owned nothing impressive except a reliable car and a good set of tools. That his apartment had too many drawings on the refrigerator and not enough artwork on the walls, and that he'd long since stopped caring about the imbalance. What do the drawings look like? Sienna asked. Like a 6-year-old made them, which is to say, chaotic and very confident. Any particular subjects? Right now she's on a dolphin phase. I have approximately 15 dolphins on the refrigerator. After the dinosaurs? After the dinosaurs. The Spinosaurus era ended when she watched a nature documentary about ocean life. She pivoted fast. What ended the volcano phase? The Spinosaurus documentary? Sienna stared at him. The same documentary? It's a very good documentary. What is this documentary? Wild Blue Planet. It covers volcanoes in the first episode, then pivots to ocean life. So she watched episode 1, became obsessed with volcanoes, then watched episode 2 and transferred the obsession. Instantly. No transition period. That's actually impressive. Most people resist change. She's 6. She doesn't have the ego investment yet. Sienna laughed, and this time she didn't cover it. It changed the shape of her face entirely. Softer, younger, like the professional armor she wore came off in layers, and he was slowly seeing more of what was underneath. He wanted to see more. On their 4th time together, which they'd stopped calling dates, maybe because the word felt like too much pressure, or maybe because it had stopped being adequate, Sienna met Mia. It wasn't planned. It was a Saturday afternoon, and they'd been at a farmer's market near his neighborhood, and Landon had gotten a call from his neighbor saying Mia had scraped her knee at the playground and wasn't critically injured, but was requesting her dad with some urgency, which was how Mrs. Pedersen described things. Landon had apologized to Sienna and moved toward his car, and Sienna had said simply, "I'll come." He'd looked at her. She'd looked back, steady, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Okay," he said. Mia was sitting on Mrs. Pedersen's couch with a bandage on her knee and a juice box in her hand when they arrived, looking more indignant than pained. She was small for 6, with Landon's brown eyes and a chin she'd inherited from his side of the family, and she looked at Sienna with the unself-conscious directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't curious. "Who are you?" Mia said. "Mia," Landon said. "What?" "I'm just asking." "It's okay," Sienna said. She crouched down to Mia's level, which was something adults often didn't bother to do. "I'm Sienna. I'm a friend of your dad's." "How'd you meet?" "She fell in a canal," Landon said, because he wasn't going to explain blind dates to a 6-year-old. Mia looked immediately more interested. "Did you get wet?" "Completely." "Did you see any fish?" Sienna appeared to genuinely consider this. "I wasn't really looking for fish at the time. I was busy." "What were you doing?" "Helping someone who needed help." Mia considered her with the unreadable gravity children sometimes adopt when they're running a calculus you can't see. Then she looked at the bandage on her knee. "I have a scrape," she announced. "I can see that. Does it hurt?" "Kind of. Not a lot." A pause. "Dad puts ice on it, but I don't like the ice." "I don't either," Sienna said. "Ice is the worst part." "You've had scrapes?" "More than I can count." Mia looked at Sienna's arms. Sienna turned her forearm slightly, where the scratch from the canal wall had mostly faded to a thin, pale line. Mia studied it with the interest of a fellow survivor, nodded once, and held out her juice box. "You want some?" Landon watched this from across the room and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't name precisely and didn't try to. That night, after Mia was in bed, he sat in the kitchen with a beer he'd barely touched and tried to think clearly about what was happening. He'd been careful the last 5 years, in the way that people become careful after they've made a mistake they're still paying for. Careful with his time, with his decisions, with whatever space he kept around himself and his daughter. He'd done it deliberately, and it had worked. Not perfectly, nothing worked perfectly, but he'd kept things manageable, quiet. What was happening with Sienna wasn't quiet. He couldn't articulate exactly what it was. They hadn't said anything significant to each other. Not yet. They hadn't made promises or declarations. There had been one moment, at the end of the farmer's market before the call came, where they'd been standing next to each other looking at a display of pottery, and she'd leaned slightly against his arm. Not dramatically, just a small shift of weight, like proximity had stopped being something she was carefully measuring. And he had not moved away. Small things. But small things added up. He picked up his phone and looked at her last text, which was from that evening. "She's wonderful. Thank you for letting me come." And then, after a pause, "For what it's worth, she has great instincts." The scrape assessment was very professional, he'd replied, She says the same about you. Which was true. Mia had said very seriously when he'd been tucking her in, Sienna's nice. She didn't say anything dumb about my knee, which was high praise from a child who had recently fired her pediatrician from emotional consideration after he called her buddy. He set the phone down, looked at the refrigerator covered in dolphin drawings. He was in trouble. That was what it was. He was in trouble in the particular way you get into trouble when something starts to matter, and you know, in the back of your mind, that mattering means it can also hurt. He finished the beer. He washed the glass. He turned off the kitchen light. He decided to stop thinking about it and go to sleep, and then he lay in the dark thinking about it for another hour before he finally did. Well, 2 weeks after that, he found out who she was. Not from her. That was the thing. She hadn't hidden it exactly, but she hadn't offered it either, and he hadn't thought to look, hadn't had a reason to until he was sitting in the break room at work, and Marcus, one of the project managers, slapped a magazine down on the table in front of him. "Your girl's on the cover of Wired," Marcus said. Landon looked down. The magazine was 3 months old, dog-eared at the corners. On the cover was a photograph of a woman in a white shirt standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, looking at something outside the frame, her expression composed and unreadable. The headline read, "Sienna Vale, the Architect of Invisible Security." He stared at the photograph for a long moment. The woman in the photo and the woman who had sat across from him in a cafe and borrowed flip-flops were the same person. He knew that objectively. He could see it, but they felt like two different people entirely, and he wasn't sure what to do with that. He read the article over lunch. It was 4,000 words and covered things she hadn't mentioned. The company's valuation, $3.2 billion at last assessment, the government contracts, the expansion into 11 countries, the awards, the speaking engagements, the profile she'd built. It mentioned, in passing, that she was famously private and rarely seen at industry events she isn't hosting. Famously private. He'd had coffee with her 4 times, and she'd met his daughter, and he hadn't known she was worth more money than he could conceptualize. He sat with that for a while, trying to figure out how he felt about it. Mostly what he felt was something like vertigo. The sensation of having been standing on ground that was suddenly a different height than he'd thought. Not betrayed. She hadn't lied, but the ground had shifted. He called her that evening. "I saw the Wired piece," he said when she picked up. A pause. "Oh, 3.2 billion, he said. "That number is outdated," she said, "and also not—" She stopped. "I should have told you sooner." "Why didn't you?" A long pause this time, long enough that he almost spoke again. "Because I wanted you to know me first," she said finally. "The rest of it, the company, the valuation, all of it, it comes with a lot of noise. People hear it, and then that's all they can see. I wanted—" She paused again. "I wanted a few weeks where I was just a person." He thought about what she'd said that first night. "It's mine. It's not separate from me enough for me to evaluate whether I like it." "Okay," he said. "Okay?" she repeated. "Yeah, I get it. You're not—" She seemed uncertain. "You're not upset?" "I'm a little disoriented," he said honestly, "but I'm not upset. You pulled a kid out of a canal in a good jacket. The rest of it is—" Thought about it. "It's information. It doesn't change what I've actually seen." Another pause, and then she laughed, short and a little unsteady, like she'd been holding her breath. "You're a strange man, Landon Hayes. Mia says I'm weird, but in a good way." "She's right," Sienna said. "She has good instincts." "I know. I may have mentioned." They stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes that night, talking about nothing consequential. A terrible movie she'd watched on a flight, a problem at his job site involving a subcontractor and a delivery of the wrong grade of steel, Mia's latest dolphin drawing, which had achieved what Landon described as uncanny accuracy considering she's never seen the ocean. He hung up thinking about the photograph on the magazine cover, the composed, unreadable woman looking at something outside the frame, and then the woman across the table, hands wrapped around a tea mug, still shaking faintly, the scratch on her forearm. His name was Oliver. That's what his mother kept saying. Oliver, Oliver, Oliver. He didn't have the language yet for what he was starting to feel. But he knew it was there, and he knew it was real, and he knew, with the specific resignation of a man who'd tried to avoid exactly this, that it was already too late to turn it off. The rain had started it. Or maybe something had started even before that, in whatever version of things you believed in. The kind where two people move through the world on separate tracks that have been converging for years without either of them knowing it. Landon Hayes didn't believe in things like that, generally. He was starting to reconsider. The thing about knowing someone's worth $3 billion is that it changes the texture of ordinary moments, even when you don't want it to. Landon noticed it in small ways. The next time Sienna suggested a restaurant, he found himself glancing at the menu prices before he caught himself doing it. When she mentioned offhandedly that she'd had a meeting in San Francisco that morning and flown back for lunch, he'd done the math on what that meant. The private flight, the logistics that moved like water around a person whose time had that kind of value, and then forced himself to stop doing the math. When she showed up to one of Mia's Saturday soccer games in jeans and a jacket that looked like something you'd buy at a normal store, he spent the first 5 minutes wondering if the jacket actually cost $800, and then felt foolish about spending 5 minutes on it. She was still the same person. That was the honest truth. She was still the person who asked questions and actually listened, who had met Mia by crouching to her level, who had texted him a photograph of a news article about Oliver's family a week after the canal incident because she'd been following up and wanted him to know the boy was fine and had started first grade. She was still the person who, when he'd mentioned once that he hadn't been to a bookstore in years because there was never time, had shown up to their next coffee with a paperback she'd bought on her way over, pressing it into his hands without ceremony. "It's good. You'll like it. Don't read the back cover, just start on page 1. He'd liked it. He'd told her so, and she'd seemed genuinely pleased. Not in the way people perform pleasure at being right, but in the way you feel when something small works out the way you hoped. None of that had changed, but the knowledge sat at the edge of things, a context he was still calibrating. He didn't talk to anyone about it except his sister, once, about 2 weeks after the Wired magazine incident. "You knew," he said to Renata on the phone. "I knew," she confirmed. "You didn't tell me." "She asked me not to. She said she'd tell you herself when it felt right." A pause. "Are you angry?" "No." "Are you weird about it?" He thought about that. "A little." "Why?" "Because it changes the balance of things. She has resources I can't compete with. If this becomes something real, Mia is going to grow up seeing what that looks like. And I'm not sure—" "Landon." "What?" "You're building a case against something you want," Renata said, "because building a case feels safer than wanting it." He didn't answer. "I'm right," she said, not unkindly. "You're annoying," he said. "Also true." He hung up and stood in his kitchen and thought about it for a while. And then he went and picked Mia up from school, and she showed him a drawing she'd made of a dolphin with what she called realistic teeth, and he put it on the refrigerator next to the other 15, and he thought, maybe Renata was right. Maybe he was doing the thing he always did, which was finding the structural problem in something before it had a chance to prove itself. He called Sienna that evening, told her he'd been weird about the money thing, and was done being weird about it. "You weren't that weird," she said. "I was calculating the cost of your jacket in my head." "Which jacket?" "The gray one, from the soccer game." A pause. "It was $60. I bought it at a second-hand shop near my office." He hadn't expected that. "Really?" "I like that store. They have good sweaters." She sounded faintly amused. "The expensive clothes are for the job. The rest of the time I just want to be comfortable." "That's... okay, that actually helps. I'm glad a $60 jacket resolved your existential crisis." "Don't make fun of me." "I'm not," she said. "I think it's one of the more honest things you've said to me." He let that sit for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm not..." He wasn't sure how to phrase it. "I don't want anything from you, the company, the money. None of that is... I need you to know that." "I know," she said, and then quieter. "That's actually why I didn't want to tell you at first. Because once people know, it's all they can think about. And I've been looking at you for 2 months waiting for it to show up, and it hasn't." "It showed up a little." "Yeah, but you noticed it, and you told me." A pause. Most people don't even notice it's happening. He shuts. By the time October arrived, they had settled into something that neither of them had named, but both of them were clearly living inside. Saturday mornings sometimes meant Mia's soccer games, which Sienna attended with a thermos of coffee and a genuine interest in the proceedings that Landon found quietly, embarrassingly moving. Tuesday evenings were often a phone call, sometimes an hour, sometimes longer. They'd had dinner twice at his apartment, Sienna helping in the kitchen with the slightly overeager helpfulness of someone who was technically capable but more accustomed to things being done for her, and Mia sitting at the kitchen counter offering opinions nobody had asked for. "You cut the onion wrong," Mia told Sienna the second time. "There's a wrong way to cut an onion," Sienna said. "Dad cuts it different." "Different isn't wrong," Landon said from across the kitchen. "She said wrong, not different," Sienna said, looking at Mia. "Show me the right way." Mia had accepted this responsibility with great seriousness, climbing down from the counter and positioning herself next to Sienna to demonstrate. Sienna had watched, adjusted her grip, and proceeded with studied concentration, and Mia had given a single nod of approval and climbed back up. Landon had turned toward the stove so neither of them could see his face. But underneath the ordinary texture of it, the soccer games, the dinners, the phone calls, something was happening with Sienna that she was only letting him see in pieces. She was worried about something. He could feel it in the conversations that stopped slightly before they were finished, in the occasional long silences when she'd be mid-sentence and trail off like a thought had ambushed her from a different direction. He didn't push. He'd learned by then that Sienna didn't respond well to being pushed, not because she shut down, but because she needed space to arrive at things in her own time. So he waited, and he watched, and he let her come to it. She came to it on a Wednesday evening in mid-October when she called him at 9:30, which was late for her. She was usually exhausted by 9 on weekdays, and her voice had a flatness to it that he recognized as the sound of someone who had been holding something for too long. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yeah. It's about the company." A pause. "It's been going on for a while and I didn't want to bring it into this, but I'm running out of places to put it." "Tell me," he said. She told him. It took 45 minutes, and it came out in a way that wasn't linear. She'd get to a specific incident and then backtrack to give context, then jump ahead, then stop and correct herself. He listened without interrupting, and what he heard was this. 8 months ago, she'd noticed irregularities in how certain board decisions were being processed. Not dramatic, not obvious. The kind of thing you'd dismiss as administrative friction if you weren't paying close attention. She had been paying close attention because she was always paying close attention, and what she'd found when she started looking harder was worse than friction. 3 of her senior executives, men who had been with the company for years, who she had promoted, mentored, trusted with the weight of things she'd built from nothing, had been quietly working to consolidate enough board support to force a leadership change. They'd been doing it methodically and carefully, the way you did things when you understood the systems involved. Manipulating voting agreements, cultivating relationships with outside investors, building a narrative that Sienna was too emotionally involved with the company to lead it through its next stage of growth, that it needed, as they'd apparently said in private, more objective governance. "More objective governance," Landon repeated. "Meaning not me," she said. "Meaning someone they could manage." "Who are they?" She gave him 3 names. He wrote them down without thinking, then looked at the paper and wasn't sure why he'd done it. It wasn't like he could do anything about them. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About 3 months." A pause. "In detail, about 3 months. I suspected something longer than that." "Why haven't you, He stopped. "What's your legal standing? Can you fight it?" "It depends on what they do next and how they do it. Delphine, she's on my board. She's the one I trust. She's been working with our legal team. We have documentation. We're building the case." She paused. "But it's a shareholders' meeting, ultimately. If they get enough votes, they can move to remove me, and then it's a fight I might not win, even if I'm right." "When's the meeting?" 2 months. "Okay." He leaned back against his headboard. The room was dark except for the light in the hallway he always left on for Mia. What do you need right now? What do you mean? I mean, do you want me to try to help solve it, or do you want me to just listen? Because I can do either, but they're different. A long pause. Nobody's ever asked me that before, she said. Which one did you want? I think... Another pause. I think I just wanted to say it out loud to someone who isn't a lawyer or a board member. I've been speaking to people about the legal strategy for 3 months, and that's necessary, but it's also... It doesn't make it feel any less awful. Then I'll just listen, he said. Keep going. She did. She talked for another 30 minutes, about the specific betrayal of it, about the executive named Craig Willard, who she'd mentored personally, who she'd promoted twice, who had apparently been the architect of most of the strategy against her, about what it felt like to walk into her own office knowing that the people around her had been calculating behind her back, about the particular loneliness of being the person at the top, where there was almost no one you could be honest with without it affecting how they operated or giving them information they could use against you. I don't know how to trust my own read on people anymore, she said. That's the worst part. These were people I thought I knew, and I was wrong, and now I walk into a room and I'm... She stopped. I'm doing math on everyone. That's not going to last forever, he said. You don't know that. No, but I've seen you with Mia, with Mrs. Pedersen, with the barista at that place in Capitol Hill whose name you actually know and ask about. You're not someone who stops being able to read people. You're just someone who got burned. Those are different things? Yeah, he said. One is permanent. One is just recovery time. She was quiet for a moment. You're oddly good at this, she said. I spent 5 years being the only adult in a room with a child who needed honest answers, he said. You get efficient at knowing what's actually needed. Is that what I am? A child who needed honest answers? No, he said. You're a person who needed someone to listen without turning it into a strategy session. She laughed, a small tired sound. Yes, that's exactly it. He heard her exhale, the kind that means something has been put down. What changed after that conversation was subtle but real. She started telling him things earlier, not waiting until they'd accumulated past the point of manageable. He learned the company's name formally, Veil Technology, which he'd already known from the article, but which sounded different when she said it, heavier with what it meant. He learned the names of the executives who were moving against her, Craig Willard, Dean Forsyth, Marcus Holt, and the specific ways each of them was working the problem. He learned that Delphine Chen, the woman who'd backed Sienna with $80,000 at a conference years ago, was now the only person inside the company Sienna trusted completely. In exchange, Landon told her things he hadn't said out loud in years, about his ex-wife, Lauren, not with anger, which surprised him, just with a quiet kind of exhaustion, the shape of a story he'd told so many times internally that he'd worn it smooth. Lauren had left when Mia was 14 months old, not for another person, not in a dramatic way. She'd just come to him one evening and said she wasn't who she'd thought she was when they got married, and that staying would make all three of them unhappy in ways that mattered. He'd been devastated, and then furious, and then, after a long time, he'd come to understand what she meant, even if he didn't forgive her for the way she'd done it. She still sees Mia occasionally, he said, twice a year maybe. It works. Better than you'd expect. Mia doesn't have a wound about it the way I was afraid she would. She just has a mother she doesn't know very well, which is its own thing. Does that make it better or worse? Sienna asked. Both, he said. I don't have to watch Mia hurt over it, but sometimes I wonder if the hurt is just deferred. You think about that a lot. Every day. She seems solid, Sienna said carefully. Like someone who has a foundation. She has a foundation, he agreed. I've been very deliberate about that. I know. She paused. I can see it in how she moves through the world, like she's confident the floor will hold. He didn't know what to say to that. It was possibly the best thing anyone had ever said about his parenting, and it had been said so plainly, without performance, that it landed somewhere underneath his ribs. Thank you, he said. I'm just describing what I see. November came in cold and wet, which in Seattle was redundant but felt significant anyway. The pressure around Vail Technology had escalated. Sienna mentioned, carefully, that the executives were starting to move faster, that there had been a board member they'd believed was neutral who had apparently flipped. Landon watched her manage it from the outside, which was its own particular experience. She was composed and precise in how she talked about it, but he could see the cost of the composure in the tightness around her eyes, in the evenings when she was slower to laugh at things that would have gotten her a week earlier. He made her dinner once that month at her place, which was the first time he'd been there, a condo on the 14th floor of a building in South Lake Union that had floor-to-ceiling windows and was very clean and felt, in some way he couldn't precisely name, slightly impersonal, like someone had made all the right choices about furniture without necessarily having strong feelings about any of them. There were no drawings on the refrigerator. He'd pointed this out. She'd looked at the refrigerator for a moment. "I eat out most of the time," she said. "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. "I know what you meant." He made pasta because it was what he could do reliably in an unfamiliar kitchen, and she sat on the counter watching him cook the way Mia sometimes did, only with wine instead of juice, offering approximately no helpful suggestions. He realized at some point that she was just watching him, not thinking about anything else, not on her phone, not running some parallel internal calculation about the company or the board, just watching, with an expression that was relaxed in a way he rarely saw it. "You're staring," he said. "You said I could come to your side," she said. "I said you could help. That's different from watching. I'm observing, for educational purposes. You're sitting on the counter like a 12-year-old. The counter is very good for sitting." She took a sip of wine. "Also, your pasta technique is interesting. You keep tasting it and making a face and then adding more salt." "It keeps needing more salt." "It needs more salt every 30 seconds? Apparently." She laughed, and he could feel her relax by another degree. The tension of the day coming off in layers the way it did sometimes when she was somewhere she felt safe. That word registered in his mind with some weight. Safe. She was someone who spent a lot of energy being prepared for things, and watching her let that go, even partially, was something he'd started to notice and to feel responsible for in a way that was half pride and half something more complicated. After dinner, they sat by the windows, and the city was spread out below them like a circuit board, all lit lines and dark spaces, and she told him about the shareholders' meeting and what Delphine's legal team had found. Documentation of communications between the 3 executives and 2 outside investors, a paper trail that could, if they used it right, expose the conspiracy before it reached the vote. "It's enough," she said. "Probably. Delphine thinks it's enough. But you're not sure." "I'm not sure because the last time I was sure about people, I was wrong." She held her wine glass by the stem, turning it slowly. "These are people who knew how I think. They built a strategy around how I think. Which means there are probably angles I'm not seeing. That's the thing about a betrayal from someone who knows you. They know your blind spots." He thought about that for a moment. "Then you don't fight it alone," he said. "I have Delphine. Who knows the company? Do you have anyone who doesn't know the company? Someone who can look at it from the outside without any of the assumptions built in?" She looked at him. "Are you offering?" "I'm offering to listen and ask dumb questions," he said. "I'm a structural engineer. I know nothing about tech company governance. But sometimes the dumb questions get somewhere the smart ones don't." She studied him for a long moment with that unreadable look she sometimes had, the one from the magazine cover, and then it shifted into something else. "Okay," she said, "ask me dumb questions." He asked them. They talked for 2 more hours, him asking things like, "Why can't you just show the board the communications directly, and what stops you from going to the investors yourself before the vote? And if this Forsyth guy flipped, what did they offer him?" And most of his questions she had already thought of and had answers for, and a few of them made her pause and say, "Huh," in a way that meant they'd hit something she hadn't fully looked at. He drove home at midnight and sat in the parking garage for a minute before going in, not ready to move yet. Upstairs, Mia was asleep, Mrs. Pedersen having stayed late. He'd texted updates. Everything was fine. He sat in the car and thought about Sienna on the counter, watching him add salt. About the windows and the city and her turning a wine glass in her hands, talking through something that could take her company from her, and still finding the steadiness to be there in the room. He'd spent 5 years believing that what he'd built, the careful, contained life, the routines, the deliberate smallness of his world after the divorce, was the right configuration. That keeping things bounded was how you kept Mia safe and kept yourself functional. He was starting to wonder if he'd gotten the balance wrong. Not the protection. That was still right. Mia still needed that. But maybe the containment had a price he hadn't fully calculated. Maybe the way he'd closed things off had been about protecting himself as much as his daughter, and maybe that was fine for a season, but seasons ended. He went inside. He checked on Mia, who was face down in the pillow with one arm hanging off the mattress, in the way she slept when she was deeply out. He fixed the blanket, stood there for a moment in the dark. He thought about what Sienna had said about Mia. She's confident the floor will hold. He thought, I want to be confident the floor will hold. He thought, maybe it does. He went to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he fell asleep without running any calculations at all. Tolkien. The media found them in the last week of November. It started small. A gossip blog, the kind that trafficked in tech-adjacent rumors, posted a photograph of Sienna and Landon coming out of the Capitol Hill coffee shop. The photo was grainy and clearly taken from a distance, probably a phone, and it was accompanied by a caption that said only, Sienna Vale spotted with mystery man. Source says it's serious. He wouldn't have seen it except that Marcus at work sent him the link with 3 question marks and no other text. He stared at the photograph on his phone screen. It was him, clearly, in the navy jacket he'd been wearing that Tuesday. And it was Sienna, clearly, in the gray secondhand sweater she'd said cost $60. They were talking. He couldn't remember what about. And she was smiling at something he'd said with that crooked expression, the one she still seemed to not fully intend. He called her. I saw it, she said, before he finished saying hello. Does this happen to you often? Occasionally. I usually don't give people enough access to photograph. A pause. This is different because of what's happening at the company. My enemies have a vested interest in my personal life right now. What does that mean specifically? It means they'll use it, she said. Whatever they can find, they'll use it. They've already been building a narrative that I'm unstable, that I make emotional decisions, a relationship, especially one that came out of nowhere, that they don't know about. They'll try to make it part of that story. What kind of story? Her voice was careful. The kind that involves questioning why a woman with a $3 billion company is dating a... She stopped. Say it. I'm not going to. Sienna. A pause. A single father who works in construction. She said it flatly. That's the framing they'll use, not because it's accurate, but because it plays. He was quiet. I'm sorry, she said. I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm saying that's how they'll present it. I know, he said. I'm not... He stopped, organized his thoughts. I'm not upset about what you said. I'm trying to think about what it means for Mia. And that was the thing that mattered most, that settled in his chest like a stone. His daughter. She was 6 years old, and she was too young to understand what it meant when people wrote things about someone you loved. And Landon had very deliberately kept her life private. And now there was a photograph on the internet that started a thread he didn't know where it ended. We should talk, Sienna said. In person. Yeah, he said. We should. They met that evening, without Mia, at a place neither of them had been before. A diner off the highway in Burien, deliberately anonymous, red vinyl booths and fluorescent light, and a laminated menu the size of a road map. They sat across from each other with coffee. Neither of them was particularly drinking, and the conversation was harder than most of their conversations had been because it required them to look at things they'd been moving around rather than through. She told him the gossip post had been the beginning. She'd heard from Delphine that 2 journalists from larger outlets had already reached out to Vale Technology for comment, and that the framing of the inquiries was, as predicted, not kind. What are they saying? Landon asked. One of them specifically asked whether my personal life has affected my capacity to lead the company through a difficult period. She said it without inflection. That's the narrative they've been given. The executives are feeding it. Can you prove that? Not yet, but it fits the pattern. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. I want you to know that I won't let them make me act like this is something to be ashamed of. What's happening with the company is separate from this, but they're not going to let it be separate. No, she said, they're not. He looked at the table for a moment. What does Delphine think you should do? She thinks I should make a statement, something measured and brief that acknowledges the relationship without giving it any more oxygen than necessary. A pause. She also said, Sienna stopped. What? She said I should think about whether I want to protect the relationship by keeping some distance from you publicly until the shareholders' meeting is resolved. She looked at him directly. She was very diplomatic about it, but that's what she meant. And what do you think? He asked. Sienna looked at him for a long moment. Her face in the fluorescent light was tired in a way he'd started to recognize. Not exhausted exactly, but worn at the edges, the way things got when they'd been carrying weight for too long. I think, she said slowly, that I've spent 8 years making every decision based on what was strategically correct. And I don't regret most of them. But I'm sitting in a diner in Burien because I didn't want anyone to photograph us. And I'm about to tell you that maybe we should be more careful in public for a while. And when I imagine saying that out loud, I feel... She paused. I feel like I'm choosing the company over something I don't want to choose the company over. He heard the weight of that, the specific difficulty of being someone who had always known which thing to sacrifice. I have Mia to think about, he said. That's not separate. She needs to be protected from this, whatever happens. I know. So I'm going to be careful regardless. He looked at her. But I don't think you should make decisions about this to protect me. I'm capable of handling some noise. It won't just be noise, she said quietly. They'll come after you specifically. Make up things. The gold digger angle is already... She stopped. I've seen it in the questions they're asking. Let them. Landon, I've been talked about before, he said. By Lauren's family, when she left. By people at work who thought I was making the wrong choice staying in Seattle. By anyone who had an opinion about how a single man should raise a daughter. He looked at her steadily. I'm not new to people deciding they know my story. I've been living my actual story for 5 years. Their version doesn't change mine. She looked at him across the table in the flat fluorescent light of a diner where nobody knew them, and he saw something move through her face. Not the composed public expression, not the careful professional armor, but something underneath all of that. Something that looked like it had been waiting for someone to say exactly that for a very long time. She didn't say anything for a moment, then, You're a hard person to scare off. I'm a hard person to scare off, he agreed. She nodded once, slowly, like she was settling something internally. Her hands were still around the coffee mug. She looked down at them, then back up at him. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Outside it had started to rain again. The Seattle kind. The kind that showed up like it had always been there and planned to stay. The statement Sienna released was 7 sentences long. Delphine had drafted the first version. Sienna had rewritten it twice, cutting everything that sounded like an apology and everything that sounded like a press release until what remained was plain enough to be almost boring. She was in a relationship. It was personal. She had no further comment. The company's focus remained on its strategic priorities and the upcoming shareholders' meeting. 7 sentences. It ran on Vail Technologies' official communications channel on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon it had been picked up by 14 outlets, most of them framing it with some variation of the same angle Sienna had predicted in the Burien diner. The questions about judgment, about distraction, about what it meant that the CEO of a company facing an internal governance challenge had chosen this particular moment to go public with a relationship. Landon read 3 of the articles and then stopped reading them, which was the right decision. The details varied, but the architecture was the same. A version of him assembled from assumptions, a man defined entirely by what he didn't have. No name in the early pieces, just a source close to the situation and a person familiar with the matter, and in one notably aggressive blog post, the phrase, financially motivated. His name made it into the larger outlets by Wednesday, at which point it was too late to pretend the thing wasn't moving. He'd told Mia nothing specific. She was 6, and the particulars of tech company governance and media narratives were outside her operational range. But she was also perceptive in the specific way of children who had grown up paying close attention to the adults around them. She'd asked him twice in 1 week why he was looking at his phone so much, and both times he'd said work and changed the subject, which she'd accepted with the skeptical patience of someone filing it away for later. His coworkers were mostly decent about it. Marcus sent a text that said, "Ignore it. They don't know you," which was brief and useful. His project lead, a woman named Deb, who had known him for 4 years, stopped by his desk on Thursday and said very quietly, "You okay?" And when he said yes, she said, "Good. Now stop reading it. I can tell from your face when you have been." He'd taken that advice and enforced it with some effort. The harder thing was the calls he started getting. Not many. He wasn't famous, had no public profile, wasn't someone people could find easily. But someone had gotten his work number, and there had been 2 calls from journalists that his company's front desk had fielded and routed to him, and both times he'd said no comment and hung up and sat staring at the wall for a few minutes before he could move on. One of the callers had, before he could get the words out, said, "Mr. Hayes, is it true you were introduced to Miss Vale through her personal assistant as part of a—" And he'd hung up mid-sentence and not picked up again for the rest of the day. He and Sienna talked every day that week. The conversations were different from before. Not worse exactly, but denser, like you were navigating more weather in the same amount of space. She was managing the company situation and the media situation simultaneously, and the energy it took showed, not in the things she said, but in the half-second delays before she answered questions, the way her sentences sometimes stopped just slightly before they were finished. "How bad is it at the company?" he asked on Thursday night. "Forsyth called an informal session with 3 of the neutral board members this week," she said, "without telling me." "Can he do that?" "Technically, yes. Informal means it doesn't require notice. It's a maneuver. He's trying to shape the conversation before the official meeting." A pause. Delphine was in one of the sessions. They didn't know she'd be there. She said Forsyth spent 40 minutes on what he called leadership consistency concerns, which was— She stopped. "Which was about you." "Which was about me and the media coverage and what he described as a pattern of decisions that prioritize personal considerations over corporate governance." She said the words like she'd memorized them precisely, which she probably had. He cited the relationship, twice. Landon was quiet for a moment. "He used me as a data point." "He used us," she said. He heard the distinction. He appreciated it. What's Delphine's read? She thinks we can still win the vote if we get the documentation in front of the right people before the meeting. We have the communications, the emails, the private channel messages between Willard and Forsyth, 3 months of it. It's clear enough. But timing matters, and if they call the vote early, can they? With enough board support, they can move the meeting forward. And if Forsyth has been working the neutral members— She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Nothing," she said quickly. I don't want you to have to manage this." "I'm already managing it. I got a call at work today." A pause. "I know. My communications team told me. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. I just want to know what we're dealing with." He paused. "Together. What we're dealing with together." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing. "Together," she said, and the words seemed to cost her something, or maybe give her something. He wasn't sure which. The story broke on a Saturday. Not the story about the company. That was still contained, still a rumor in industry circles, not yet public in any documented way. What broke on Saturday was worse in a different sense. A story about Landon specifically, sourced to someone who claimed to know him, laying out a narrative that bore almost no relationship to his actual life. He read it at 7 in the morning, standing in his kitchen in a t-shirt while Mia was still asleep. The headline was crafted to be technically deniable. Questions surround Sienna Vale's new relationship. But the body of the piece was not deniable at all. It described Landon as someone who had been financially struggling before meeting Sienna, who had been introduced through mutual connections in circumstances the article deliberately left vague and suggestive, and who had, according to an unnamed source, expressed interest in Ms. Vale's business connections on multiple occasions. None of it was true. The financial struggling was a fabrication. He wasn't wealthy, but he was fine, had always been fine, had never asked Sienna for anything. The circumstances of their meeting were twisted from an actual event into something that implied calculation. The expressed interest in business connections was invented wholesale, attributed to a source who didn't exist or had made something up. He set the phone down on the counter. He stood there for a minute. He picked it up and read it again to make sure he hadn't misread it. And he hadn't. Then Mia's door opened, and she came out in her pajamas with her hair in the state it always achieved overnight. An architectural disaster. Dragging her stuffed elephant by one ear, and she looked at him and said, "Why are you standing there?" "Just thinking," he said. "About what?" "About what you want for breakfast." She considered this with the gravity the question deserved. "Eggs," she said. "The kind with the crispy edges." Crispy edges," he confirmed. He made eggs. He kept his face arranged into something that wasn't what he was actually feeling, which was a mix of anger and something colder underneath the anger. The specific cold of understanding that someone had looked at your life and decided to invent a version of it that served their purposes, and that there was functionally nothing you could do about it in the short term except stand there and be misrepresented. He called Sienna after Mia left for a play date at noon. "I've seen it," Sienna said the moment she picked up. "Where did it come from?" "We're working on that. My communications team thinks it's Willard. He has a contact at that outlet. There's a history there. But we can't prove it yet." Her voice was controlled in a way that meant she was working hard to keep it that way. "Landon, Don't," he said. "I was going to say I'm angry," she said, not apologizing. "I'm angry on your behalf." "Okay." He breathed out. "Good. Be angry. So am I." "The source doesn't exist," she said. "Whatever they claimed, it didn't come from anyone who actually knows you. It's manufactured." "I know that." "We can push back. My communications team can put out a correction. We can—" "Does that help, or does it just give the story more oxygen?" She paused. "The second one," she admitted. "Usually the second one." "Then let it sit," he said. "I'm not going to start a public fight with a source that doesn't exist. It's not worth Mia seeing that." She was quiet for a moment. "You're better at this than I am," she said. "I'm not better at it. I just have less to lose publicly." "That's not—" She stopped. "How are you actually doing? Not strategically. Actually." He leaned against the counter in the quiet apartment. "I'm angry," he said. "And I feel like someone broke into my house and moved things around, not enough to see immediately, but enough that the rooms feel wrong." "That's exactly what it is," she said. "That's exactly what they did." "It doesn't change anything for me," he said, "about us. I want to be clear about that." "I know. But I need you to know that I'm not going to let it affect Mia. If this gets worse, if it gets to a point where she could see it or it touches her life in a direct way, I'm going to do whatever I have to do to protect her. Even if that means pulling back from public things temporarily." "Of course," Sienna said immediately. "That's not even a question. She comes first." "She comes first," he confirmed. The conversation was quiet after that for a moment, and he could feel them both sitting with the weight of it. The odd situation of caring about something that was simultaneously being targeted because they cared about it. "I want to fix this," Sienna said. "I'm going to fix this." "The company thing?" "All of it. But yes, if I can prove what Willard and Forsyth have been doing, if I can bring it into the open before the meeting, the story about you falls apart on its own, because the source of it falls apart." "You think that's the same problem?" "I think it is the same problem," she said. "I think they went after you because they knew it would hurt me, and it would hurt me because—" She stopped. He waited. "Because you matter to me," she said. Not dramatically, not with the particular cadence of a declaration, just plainly, like a fact she'd stopped qualifying. He stood in his kitchen and felt the weight of that land somewhere that had been waiting for it. "Yeah," he he said. I know. December came in gray and stayed gray. The shareholders' meeting was set for the 17th, 2 weeks out when December started, and those 2 weeks had the compressed, slightly unreal quality of time when you're waiting for something significant and can't do much to speed it along. Landon went to work. He picked up Mia. He helped with homework and made dinner, and attended one more soccer game and one school performance in which Mia played the role of a tree with what he could only describe as committed professionalism. He maintained the routines deliberately because the routines were the structure that held the rest of it up, and structure was what he knew how to do. He saw Sienna twice in those 2 weeks, both times at his apartment, both times late in the evening after Mia was in bed, because public appearances had become something to be thoughtful about, and they'd both agreed, without exactly saying so, to give the media less to work with. The visits felt different from earlier in the fall. Not worse, but more weighted, more aware of themselves. She came over on a Tuesday night, 10 days before the meeting, and she was tired in a way she usually managed to contain. She sat on his couch, and he made tea because he knew by now that she reached for hot things when she was cold in the way that had nothing to do with temperature, and he sat in the chair across from her, and she told him what had happened. Delphine had attempted to schedule a presentation to the full board, a formal presentation of the documentation, the communications, the evidence of the conspiracy. The presentation had been blocked by Forsyth on procedural grounds, citing a board charter provision about advance notice for agenda items. Is that legitimate? Landon asked. It's technically legitimate and completely in bad faith, Sienna said. The provision exists for mundane reasons. He's using it as a delay mechanism. How long does it delay you? The meeting's in 10 days. The advance notice requirement is 15 days for agenda additions, so we can't add a formal presentation item to the official agenda in time. But the meeting still happens. The meeting still happens. I'll still be there. I can still speak. She wrapped her hands around the mug. But there's a difference between a formal agenda item with prepared materials distributed to all board members in advance and one person standing up in the room and saying, "Here's what I found." The second one is easier to dismiss. Much easier to dismiss. Without the pre-reading, without the formal framing, they'll call it an emotional outburst. They'll have prepared for that. It plays into their narrative. Can you distribute the materials informally? Not as an agenda item. She looked at him. Explain. You can't add it to the official agenda. But can you send the documentation directly to each board member before the meeting? Not as a formal filing, just as information? She was quiet for a moment. Delphine suggested something similar. The concern is that it gives Forsyth time to pre-spin it before the meeting. If the members get the materials 3 days out and Forsyth has already called each of them before the meeting, what if they get the materials the morning of? She looked at him. Not 3 days? Not advance notice. The morning of the meeting. Early enough to read it, late enough that there's no time for Forsyth to organize a counter-narrative before the room comes together. He paused. Is that legally permitted? It's not on the agenda, so there's nothing prohibiting it. She was thinking now. He could see it. It would need to be timed correctly. And we'd need to make sure the presentation in the room backs up what they received. Can you prepare for that? In 10 days. She looked at the tea. Maybe. Then more quietly, yeah, I think we can. He hadn't solved anything. He wasn't foolish enough to think a layman's question had cracked a problem her entire legal team hadn't considered. But sometimes you heard a thing you'd already thought from a different direction, and it shook loose the resistance, and he could see that happening in her face right now. You were already thinking about this, he said. I was thinking around it, she said. I kept getting stuck on the advance notice issue and treating it as a wall instead of a parameter. She looked at him. The dumb questions thing. Not dumb. No, not dumb. She took a breath. Okay, I need to call Delphine. It's 10:30. Delphine keeps strange hours. She was already reaching for her phone, then stopped. Thank you. I didn't do anything. You said the thing that needed to be said. She looked at him steadily. That counts for more than you think. He watched her call Delphine, watched her voice shift into the precise, efficient register she used for work, the composure that cost her, that she wore like armor. He thought about what it meant that she let him see the other version, the tired one, the uncertain one, the one who needed tea and quiet and someone to ask the question from the outside. He thought about what it cost her to let someone in that far, given what the people she'd let in before had done with the access. What? The story broke again on December 9th, 8 days before the meeting. This time it wasn't a gossip blog or an industry outlet. This time it was a major national publication, and the story was specifically about Landon. It had photographs, not of him and Sienna together this time, but of him alone, taken over what appeared to be several days. Images of him going to work, picking up Mia from school, walking to his car. Surveillance photographs, though the article didn't use that word. The article named him fully, listed where he worked, described his background in terms that were technically accurate and shaped to imply inadequacy. It described his divorce, imprecisely, but close enough to be recognizable, and included a quote from an unnamed source who claimed to have known him during that period and described him as having been financially and emotionally unstable for years. The financial instability was, again, fabricated. The emotional instability was the particular kind of lie that works because it's unfalsifiable. You can't prove you've never been unstable, and the phrase is vague enough to survive denial. But the photographs of Mia, he hadn't known they'd taken photographs of Mia. She was in 2 of them, blurred in the background, clearly unintentionally captured, but there. His 6-year-old daughter in a photograph in a national publication, unasked, unaware, in an article designed to damage her father. He sat with that for a long time before he called anyone. He called Sienna first, which surprised him slightly. His instinct was usually to go inward, to close the circle, to handle things himself. That instinct had served him well for 5 years. But when he picked up the phone, his hands already knew who he was calling. She answered on the second ring. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting for you to call. They photographed Mia." "I know." Her voice was very careful. "I saw them. Their background, they're blurred. She's in a national publication," he said. "She's 6 years old and she's in a national publication without her knowledge and without my consent and because of—" He stopped. Not because he couldn't finish the sentence, but because he needed a moment before he said the rest of it. "Because of this. Because of us." Sienna was quiet. "I'm not angry at you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I know where this is coming from. I know who's doing it. I know. But I need you to understand what this changes for me." He was standing in the kitchen again, the same spot, the same posture as 8 days ago when he'd read the first article. "Mia is not negotiable. She's not collateral in this. She can't be in photographs that people are looking at to get to you. She can't be part of this story." "I understand," Sienna said. Her voice was controlled, but he could hear the thing underneath it, the hard edge of something that was trying not to break. "What do you need from me?" He had thought about it. He'd sat with it for an hour before calling, turning it over, looking at it from every angle the way he looked at structural problems, trying to find where the weight was resting and what would hold it and what wouldn't. "I think we need to step back," he said, "publicly, until the meeting is done and whatever is going to happen has happened. No appearances together, no connection visible to anyone looking for it. Not because—" He stopped. "Not because I want to, but because Mia doesn't get a choice in this, and I do." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he started to say her name. "I understand," she said. "I do. You're right. This isn't me leaving," he said. I need you to hear that. This is me protecting my daughter." "I know the difference," she said. Her voice was even, but something in it wasn't. A hairline crack, barely audible. The sound of someone keeping something together by will. "Sienna." "I'm okay." A pause. I understand why this has to happen. It doesn't make it easy to hear." "I know." He pressed his palm flat against the counter. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. You're doing what you're supposed to do." She took a breath. "She's lucky to have you." He couldn't say anything to that immediately. He stood there and the apartment was quiet and Mia was asleep down the hall, breathing and unknowing and blurred in a photograph somewhere on the internet. 8 days, he said. "The meeting is 8 days." 8 days, she confirmed. "Then we deal with whatever the meeting produces, and we go from there." He paused. "Together, on the other side." "On the other side," she said. "Yeah." He hung up. He stood in the dark kitchen for a long time, and the anger was still there, but underneath it was something more complicated. Grief, maybe, for the simple version of things that had existed before the photographs and the articles and the machinery of other people's agendas had found its way into his life. He thought about a cafe in October, the sound of rain on windows, a woman in borrowed flip-flops who had pulled a child out of a flooded canal and arrived on time anyway. He thought about her saying, "I wanted a few weeks where I was just a person." He'd given her that, and she'd given him something he hadn't known to ask for, and now the weeks were over and they were both standing in the part that cost something. He thought, this is what it looks like when it's real. Not the easy part, the part that asks you to be sure. He didn't call her for 3 days. It wasn't an agreement they'd explicitly made. They'd said step back publicly, not stop speaking. But he found himself not calling, and he thought she understood why, and the not calling had its own weight. Mia noticed. She noticed on the second day, when he'd been quieter than usual through dinner, and she'd looked at him across the table with her soup spoon in her hand and said, "Is Sienna okay?" He looked at her. "Why do you ask that?" "You get quiet like this when you're worried about someone," she said, with the eerie precision children sometimes achieved. "You got like this when Mrs. Pedersen's cat died." "I'm not worried about Sienna," he said carefully. "Things are just complicated right now." "Because of the internet?" He went still. "What do you mean?" "Carter at school said something." She looked at her soup. "He said his mom showed him something on the internet about you and Sienna." She poked at a noodle. "He said people were being mean." He set his fork down. He looked at his daughter, who was 6 years old and eating soup and already carrying a piece of something she shouldn't have had to know about. "Yeah," he said, after a moment. "Some people have been saying unkind things." "Why?" "Because Sienna has a big job. And sometimes when people have big jobs, other people try to use anything they can find to cause problems." "And they're using you?" He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him with those brown eyes that had his own shape and sometimes his own expression, calm and direct. "Yeah," he said, "something like that." She thought about this, then, "That's not fair." "No," he said, "it's not." "Does Sienna know?" "Sienna knows." Mia was quiet for a moment, still looking at her soup. Then she looked up. "Is she going to fix it?" He thought about the 10 days of preparation, about the documentation, about Delphine and the morning of delivery plan, about Sienna on his couch with a tea mug and tired eyes saying, "I'm going to fix this." "She's working on it," he said. Mia nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her soup. He watched her and felt something he couldn't name fully, a complex aggregate of things, yet pride in her and grief about what she'd absorbed without him knowing, the particular helplessness of loving someone you can't fully protect. And underneath all of it, something steadier, the knowledge that however this resolved, whatever happened in 8 days and then 7 and then 6, he knew what he was doing here. He wasn't lost. He wasn't operating from fear the way he'd operated for 5 years. He was just a man who had let something matter and was standing in the part of it that cost something and was not running. On the 4th day, Sienna texted him. Delphine confirmed the morning of strategy. "Legal is ready. 8 board members have been identified as genuinely persuadable. We have enough. I think we have enough." He read it twice, standing outside his work site in the cold. "Good," he typed back. Then, "How are you?" A pause. Then, "Scared, prepared, both." "That sounds about right." Another pause, longer. Then, "I miss talking to you." He stood in the cold with the phone in his hand and the job site noise around him, and he thought about the diner in Burien and the windows in South Lake Union and a 6-year-old girl who wanted to know if Sienna was okay. 4 more days, he wrote back. "Then we talk." 4 days, she replied. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to work, and he kept moving, the way you kept moving when the only thing you could do was get to the other side. The morning of December 17th arrived the way significant days sometimes did, indistinguishable from ordinary ones until you were already inside it. Landon was up at 5:40, which was earlier than necessary and later than he'd actually slept. He'd been lying in the dark since 4:15, running calculations he had no business running because the outcome of today had nothing to do with anything he could control. He knew this. He did it anyway, which was a very human thing to do and also deeply unhelpful. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky go from black to the particular dark blue that preceded Seattle's reluctant winter dawns. And he thought about the 4 days of relative silence between him and Sienna. Not complete silence, a handful of texts, but the carefully maintained distance they'd agreed on. And he thought about what today was going to cost her, one way or another. He'd sent her a text at 5:50. Just, today's the day. You're ready. Her reply came at 6:03. I know, I am. Then after a pause, thank you for saying it anyway. He'd looked at that for a moment, then put the phone in his pocket and gone to wake Mia up for school. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Vail Technologies headquarters, a building in the South Lake Union neighborhood that Landon had driven past dozens of times without knowing what it was. 12 stories of glass and steel with the company name in modest letters above the main entrance. The kind of building that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. Sienna had described it to him once as functional and slightly cold, which was not what I intended when we designed it, but I was 26 and I didn't know yet that buildings have personalities. He thought about that as he drove Mia to school. Buildings have personalities. He thought about the condo on the 14th floor with its perfect sight lines and its empty refrigerator, and the way Sienna had looked in it. Slightly mismatched, like the furniture had been chosen by someone who knew what was correct and not quite what was hers. He thought about her on his couch with a tea mug, the way the rooms felt when she was in them. He dropped Mia off. She'd given him an extra long hug at the school gate, which she sometimes did when she sensed something in the air that the adults weren't naming, and he'd held on an extra second too. Have a good day, he said. You too, she said very seriously, like she was issuing a directive. He drove back toward the city. The documentation had gone out at 6:30 a.m., timed by Delphine's team to land in each board member's inbox before they'd left for the meeting, late enough that the commute and the morning's logistics would eat the window before anyone could make organized phone calls. 114 pages of communications, financial records, and third-party correspondence, with a 4-page executive summary at the front that Sienna and Delphine had rewritten 11 times over the preceding 4 days to be clear and irrefutable, and completely devoid of anything that could be characterized as emotional. It had taken everything Sienna had not to make it personal, because it was personal. Every line of it was personal. 3 years of trust inverted, the specific wound of being understood well enough that someone could use your own patterns against you. She'd written a version of the executive summary that said exactly that named it for what it was, and then she'd deleted it because Delphine was right. The room didn't need her anger. The room needed the facts, and the facts were sufficiently damning without her fingerprints on them. She arrived at the building at 8:15, 2 hours before the meeting, which gave her time to walk through the materials one more time with Delphine in the small conference room off the main boardroom. Delphine Chen was 53 years old, compact and precise, with short gray hair and the particular quality of stillness that characterized people who had been in many difficult rooms and learned to treat them as problems rather than emergencies. She'd been in Sienna's corner for 8 years. Today she was in full operational mode, which meant she was very calm and very focused and communicated primarily through nods and the occasional short declarative sentence. The Holt situation is the variable, Delphine said, setting a coffee on the table beside Sienna without ceremony. He's seen the materials. He hasn't responded. He won't respond before the meeting, Sienna said. He'll want to see which way the wind is blowing in the room before he commits. That's consistent with how he's operated. Which means we need the room to be unambiguous before he has to decide. Sienna looked at the printed executive summary. What's your read on Kessler? Kessler is solid. She's been uncomfortable with Forsyth's methods for months. She just hasn't had documented grounds to oppose him formally. Now she does. Delphine paused. Park and Obuya are your swing votes. They're not ideologically aligned with Forsyth, but they don't like disruption, and this is disruptive. I'm not the one who created the disruption. I know that. They know that. The question is whether they prioritize accountability or stability. Delphine looked at her. You need to speak first, before Forsyth has a chance to set the frame. Whatever procedural maneuver he tries at the opening, and he will try something. You need to be on your feet before the room has a chance to settle into his narrative. I know. And you need to be calm. I know. Not performed calm, actually calm. Delphine paused. Which is different from what you are right now. Sienna looked at her. I'm calm. You've been stirring that coffee for 4 minutes, and you haven't drunk any of it. Delphine took the spoon out of Sienna's hand and set it on the table. You built this company from nothing, Sienna. You've been in rooms far more hostile than this one. Today you have documentation, preparation, and the moral high ground. That combination wins. It should win. It will win. Delphine held her gaze. And if it doesn't win today, we take it to the next available mechanism and we win there. This doesn't end today regardless of how today goes. But it's going to go well. Sienna nodded. She picked up the coffee and drank some of it, which was cold and not good, and it didn't matter. Tell me the names in order, Delphine said. Sienna told her. They went through the board, member by member, what each one needed to hear and how, until the shape of the room was something she knew by memory rather than by anxiety. At 9:40, she stood up, straightened her jacket, and went to get it done. Forsyth was already in the boardroom when she entered. He was standing near the windows talking to one of the outside investors, a man named Reardon, who had been on the board for 6 years, and whom Sienna had always found technically competent and personally opaque. Forsyth looked over when she came in. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one, and had learned to treat them as a natural habitat. He'd been with Vale Technology for 4 years. She had promoted him to Chief Operating Officer 18 months ago, on the basis of a track record she now understood differently. He met her eyes for a second, then looked back at Reardon. Not aggressive, not guilty, blank. The blankness of someone who had decided the outcome already and was waiting for the formalities to confirm it. She took her seat at the head of the table. The room filled in over the next 15 minutes. 11 board members total, plus legal counsel for the company, plus Delphine in her capacity as both board member and primary shareholder representative. Willard came in at 9:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled start, and sat down without looking at Sienna. Holt came in at 9:59, took the seat across from Willard, and arranged his papers with the careful attention of a man who was trying not to make eye contact with anyone. At 10 o'clock exactly, Forsyth opened his mouth. Sienna was already standing. Before we begin with the formal agenda, she said, and her voice was level and clear, and the room went quiet with the slight surprise of an interruption before the thing had properly started. I want to draw the board's attention to materials that were distributed this morning via email. If everyone can open those documents, Ms. Vale, Forsyth's voice was controlled. The agenda is for formal business items, she said, without raising her voice. What I'm raising is informational, not a motion. Board members are always permitted to introduce informational materials. I'd ask for 5 minutes. She looked around the room, not at Forsyth, at the other faces. Kessler, who was already opening her laptop. Park, who was looking at his phone, presumably pulling up the email. Obuya, who was very still. Holt, who was studying the table. 5 minutes, she said again, simply. Reardon, who was nominally chairing, looked briefly at Forsyth and then at Sienna and said, "We can take 5 minutes for informational materials." Forsyth sat back. Sienna had done this before. Spoken in difficult rooms, made arguments to people who didn't want to hear them, presented evidence of things that were easier to deny than acknowledge. But nothing she'd done in 8 years of building a company had required this particular combination of precision and restraint, and she felt it in the way you felt carrying something very heavy, not all at once, but in the accumulation of each second. She walked them through it. The summary first, 4 pages, key points. Then the communications. She didn't read them aloud. She pointed to the timestamps, the participants, the pattern. 3 months of it, laid out not dramatically, but methodically, the way Delphine had taught her. Let the facts carry the argument. Your job is not to prosecute. Your job is to illuminate. She watched the room as she spoke. Kessler's expression moved from focus to something harder and cooler. Park looked up twice from his phone screen, his face doing the particular recalibration of someone encountering information that contradicts a prior assumption. Obuya put his pen down at the 12-minute mark, which was 7 minutes past the 5 she'd asked for, and nobody had stopped her. Holt didn't look up. Willard looked at the table through most of it, which was the expression of a man who had already known this was coming and had decided that the performance of normalcy was his only remaining option. Forsyth. Forsyth looked at her. The whole time he looked directly at her, and his face was very controlled, and she looked back at him because she had earned the right to look back at him, and she didn't look away. When she finished, she sat down. The room was quiet for about 4 seconds, which in a boardroom is a long time. Then Forsyth said, "These materials represent a selective interpretation of normal business communications, and I'd suggest—" "Dean," Kessler's voice, flat, not loud. "I've read them." Forsyth looked at her. "I've read them," Kessler said again. Page 47. "The communication from you to Reardon on October 2nd. She paused. "Do you want to characterize that as normal business communication?" The silence that followed was different from the first one. Deeper, or maybe just more honest. Reardon, to his credit, looked like he was reconsidering several decisions simultaneously. The meeting ran for 3 hours and 20 minutes. Sienna didn't win every moment of it. Forsyth was skilled. He'd spent 40 years in corporate environments learning exactly how to operate in exactly these rooms, and he had moves she hadn't anticipated, and he used them. He challenged the provenance of the communications. He questioned the methodology of the summary. He proposed procedural delays that cost time and required Delphine and the legal team to counter with citations. He was not a man who surrendered easily or acknowledged things plainly, and for a significant portion of the middle of the meeting, the room had the particular quality of something that could go either way. Holt voted with Forsyth on 2 procedural questions. Sienna watched this without showing anything, cataloging it, adjusting her read of the room. Then at the 1 hour and 50-minute mark, Obuya asked Forsyth directly about the communication from November 19th, a message to Willard that was less ambiguous than most of the others, more explicit about the objective, harder to characterize as anything other than what it was. Forsyth started an explanation that involved context and framing and the particular vocabulary of someone constructing a retroactive justification, and about 90 seconds into it, Obuya held up one hand and said, "I've read it 3 times this morning. There isn't a context that changes what this says." He said it quietly, without drama, but the room heard it the way rooms hear things when they've been waiting for a direction to settle in. Park said, 5 minutes later, "I'd like to move that we table the leadership review motion currently on the agenda pending a formal investigation of the materials presented today." Kessler seconded. The vote was 7-4. Forsyth sat very still. The leadership review motion, the one that had been the culmination of the last 8 months of work against her, the one that would have begun the formal process of removing her from the company she'd built, was tabled, pending investigation. Which meant that the narrative he'd built, the strategy he'd executed, the betrayal he'd constructed over years, had not produced the outcome he'd calculated. It wasn't over. Investigations took time. Willard and Forsyth hadn't resigned and weren't going to immediately, and the work of formally resolving the governance situation would extend into the new year. She knew this. Delphine had told her this morning, and she'd absorbed it as a fact, but the room had chosen, and in choosing, it had chosen her. She thanked the board. She was professional and brief and gave nothing away in her face. She shook hands with the people whose hands she could shake without manufacturing something she didn't feel, and she didn't shake the ones she couldn't. And she walked out of the boardroom with Delphine and down the hallway toward the elevator, and then Delphine put her hand on Sienna's arm and said simply, "You did it." Sienna looked at her. "You did it," Delphine said again. And Sienna, who had held herself together through 114 pages of evidence and 3 hours and 20 minutes of the hardest professional fight of her life, felt the composure shift in a way she didn't stop. Not completely. She wasn't someone who came apart in hallways, but something let go. "We did it," she said. Delphine nodded. "Yes, but you built the foundation for it. 15 years ago, 8 years ago, every day in between." She paused. "Take the rest of today. I'll handle the communications." "I should—" "Sienna," Delphine's voice was firm but kind. Take the rest of today. Go find the person who deserves to hear this first. Landon was at his work site when his phone buzzed at 1:47 in the afternoon. One word, 7 to 4. He stood on a half-finished floor with cold wind coming through the open framing, and he read those 3 characters and he understood exactly what they meant. And he stood very still for a moment before he could move. He typed back, "Where are you?" A pause. Then, "Still at the office. I should probably be here for the next..." "Go home," he typed. "I'll come to you." Another pause. Then, "Okay." He told his site lead he was leaving for the day, which got him a look but no argument. Deb had been tracking the situation in the way a good colleague tracked things, peripherally and without comment. He drove to South Lake Union and parked in the visitor structure and rode the elevator to the 14th floor and knocked on the door of Sienna's condo at 3:15 in the afternoon. She answered the door, still in the blazer she'd worn to the meeting, jacket off, the formal shirt slightly wrinkled in a way it hadn't been that morning. Her hair was still up, but looser. She looked like someone who had been through something and was standing on the other side of it, taking inventory. He looked at her for a second. 7 to 4, he said. 7 to 4, she confirmed. He stepped inside, and she stepped back to let him, and then he closed the door behind him, and before either of them said anything else, he put his arms around her, and she leaned into it with the specific weight of someone who had been holding themselves together for a very long time and had finally reached somewhere they could stop. She didn't cry. He hadn't expected her to. She just leaned and breathed, and he held on, and the condo was very quiet around them, except for the muffled sound of the city below. After a while, she said into his shoulder, "It's not completely done." "I know. The investigation will take months. Willard and Forsyth are still..." "I know. I just want you to understand it's not..." "Sienna." He pulled back slightly to look at her. "I know it's not over. I also know that today was the day that mattered most, and you won it." She looked at him. Her eyes were tired and clear, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion was something that looked like relief. Not the performance of it, but the real thing, the kind that comes from putting something down that you've been carrying for so long you forgot it was the weight that was making everything harder. "I had help," she said. "Delphine had help," he said. "I asked dumb questions. The dumb questions mattered. Then I'll keep asking them." She almost smiled. "Promise?" "Yeah," he said. "I promise." She turned away and went to the kitchen, and he followed, and she made coffee. Good coffee, from a machine that was considerably more sophisticated than anything in his apartment, with the practiced automaticity of someone who needed something to do with their hands. He sat on one of the counter stools and watched her, the same way she'd once watched him add salt to pasta, and the symmetry of it registered with a quiet satisfaction. "Tell me what happened in the room," he said. So she told him. She started with Forsyth standing at the windows and went through 3 hours and 20 minutes in approximately 40 minutes of talking, not linearly. She circled back, noted things she'd missed until they happened, gave him the context that the texts hadn't contained. He listened and he asked the occasional question, and he watched her face move through the telling. The places where the control had been hardest to hold, the moment Obuya had put his pen down, the vote. "What did Forsyth do when the vote came in?" he asked. "He sat very still," she said. "He didn't say anything. He didn't look at Willard." She paused. "He looked at me for a second before he started gathering his things. I couldn't tell what it was, not remorse, more like someone acknowledging a result, like a chess player who sees checkmate and tips their king without saying anything. "Do you feel anything about him, now that it's done?" She thought about it. "Not what I expected," she said. "I thought I'd feel angrier, or more satisfied." She looked at her coffee. "Mostly I feel tired, and a little sad, actually. Not for him. For the version of things where he wasn't this person. Where I hadn't been wrong about him for 4 years. That's not weakness," he said, "wanting the version where people don't betray you." "I know. It's just..." She stopped. "It's expensive. Caring about people is expensive, and I've been paying the bill on this one for a while." He thought about what she'd said months ago. "I've been doing math on everyone. I don't know how to trust my own read on people anymore." He thought about how far she'd come from that sentence to this kitchen, today. a win she'd earned by preparing for every angle and trusting the right people anyway. For what it's worth, he said, your read on me was correct. She looked at him. From the start, he said, whatever your read was, it was correct. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, I know, she said. I've known for a while. Then maybe the instincts are still good. She was quiet, turning the coffee mug in her hands, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her version of thinking out loud. Then she set it down. I owe you an apology, she said. He frowned. For what? For the photographs. Of Mia. I know we talked about it, and I know you said you weren't angry at me, but... She met his eyes. She got pulled into something she had nothing to do with because of her connection to me, and I'm sorry for that, genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. It wasn't your doing, he said. It was the consequence of my situation. And your situation was created by people who chose to weaponize anything they could find, including us. He paused. You didn't make that choice. They did. Still. Sienna. He looked at her directly. I'm not holding this against you. I was scared for Mia, and I was angry, and I pulled back because I needed to protect her. Not because I blamed you. He paused. The people who did that are going to face what's coming from the investigation. That's the consequence that matters. She absorbed this, nodded slowly the way she did when she was accepting something she'd been holding against herself and finding it lighter than expected once someone else held it for a moment too. How is she? Sienna asked. Mia? Good. She asked about you a few days ago. Something moved through Sienna's face. She did? She wanted to know if you were okay. She'd heard something at school about people being mean on the internet. He paused. She said it wasn't fair. Sienna looked at the counter for a moment. She's 6, she said quietly. She's Mia, he said. She has a firm concept of fairness. What did you tell her? I told her you were working on fixing it. She was quiet for a moment. When she looked up, her expression had the quality he'd seen once before. In the diner in Burien, when she'd told him she cared about him, under the fluorescent lights. That thing underneath the armor, the thing she didn't always let show. I want to see her, Sienna said. If that's... I want to, when this settles enough. She wants to see you, he said. That's already decided from her end. Sienna laughed, a small, real sound. She's remarkable. She is, he said. I'll tell her you said so. Don't. She'll be insufferable about it. She'll be right about it, which is worse. Outside, the December light was going. 4 in the afternoon and nearly dark. The city below the windows beginning to come on in all its lit-up winter grid. He thought about the last 3 months. The cafe, the rain, the magazine cover, the drizzle in Burien, the photographs, the 4 days of silence, and now this kitchen, this afternoon, the particular quality of things settling into a shape they'd been working toward without quite naming. He thought about Mia this morning, her directive, have a good day. He thought it had been one, despite everything. What do you need tonight? He asked. She looked at him. What do you mean? Same question as always. Do you want to debrief the whole thing? Or do you want to just be somewhere quiet? She thought about it. I want to be somewhere quiet, she said. With you. I need to pick up Mia at 5:30. I know. You could come, he said, if you want. We were going to make pasta. Not because it's special, just because it's Tuesday, and that's what we do on Tuesdays. She looked at him for a moment, and the look had a texture to it. Something like tenderness, and something like relief, and something he didn't have a single word for. I'd like that, she said. Very much. He nodded. Then let's go get her. She got her coat. He waited by the door. They rode the elevator down through the 14 floors of glass and steel that had been hers for 8 years, and walked out into the December cold, and drove through the city toward the school where Mia was waiting. He pulled up to the gate at 5:28, and Mia came out in her backpack and her hat with the pom-pom she'd refused to stop wearing since September, and she saw Sienna in the passenger seat before she even opened the door, and her face did the thing it did when something landed exactly where she wanted it to be. A wide, uncomplicated, whole-body expression of satisfaction. She yanked the back door open and got in. "You won," she said to Sienna without preamble. Sienna turned around in her seat. "How did you know that?" "Dad's face." Mia settled her backpack on the seat next to her. "He makes a different face when things go right." She looked at Sienna with those direct brown eyes. "Are you okay?" "Getting there," Sienna said honestly. Mia nodded, apparently finding this acceptable. "We're making pasta," she announced. "I heard. Dad adds too much salt. I've noticed. You can help with the onions." Mia looked at her with the authority of someone assigning positions. "I'll supervise." Sienna looked at Landon. He kept his eyes on the road, but she could see his expression, the one Mia had described, the face he made when things went right. "Sounds like I'm supervised," Sienna said. "You're supervised," Mia confirmed, pulling out her library book and opening it to a page dense with photographs of humpback whales, apparently already past the dolphins. Landon pulled out of the school lot and into the early dark of a December evening, the city doing its ordinary winter thing around them, and the car was warm and quiet in the particular way it was quiet when everyone in it was comfortable enough not to fill the silence. He didn't say anything about what had happened today, or what came next, or what the new year would require as the investigation unfolded. There would be time for all of that, and it would ask things of both of them, and neither of them was under any illusion that the hard parts were entirely over. But right now there was a car, and a December evening, and a child reading about whales in the back seat, and the woman next to him was watching the city go by with an expression he'd never quite seen on her face before. Open, unguarded, not performing anything for anyone, just present in the way people sometimes were when they finally stopped bracing for impact. He reached over and put his hand over hers, briefly, on the center console. She turned it over and held on. Neither of them said anything. The lights of the city moved past the windows, and they drove home. The pasta was oversalted. Not dramatically. It was still edible, still good by most reasonable standards. But Landon had been distracted at the stove, his attention pulling between the boiling water and the sound of Sienna and Mia at the kitchen counter, and he'd added salt twice without registering that he'd already added it once, which was exactly the kind of thing Mia had been predicting for months. She pointed it out immediately, with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose assessment of a situation had been officially confirmed. "I told you," she said. "It's fine," Landon said. "It's salty." "It's seasoned." "Those aren't the same thing." Mia looked at Sienna. "Tell him those aren't the same thing." Sienna, who was eating her pasta with complete equanimity, looked up from her plate. "I'm not getting involved." "You're already involved. You're sitting right here." "I'm a neutral observer." "You said earlier that he adds too much salt. In the car." Sienna looked at Landon. Landon looked at Sienna. Sienna put another forkful of pasta in her mouth and focused with great intensity on the middle distance. "Useful," Landon said. "I try," she said, mouth still full. Mia shook her head at both of them with the weary authority of a 7-year-old who had decided that adults were fundamentally unreliable, then went back to her dinner. The kitchen was warm in the particular way it got warm in December, the radiator doing its inconsistent best, and outside the window the city was doing its dark at 5 winter thing. Landon watched Sienna reach over to refill Mia's water glass without being asked, just noticed it was low and filled it quietly, the way you did things in a space you'd become comfortable in, and felt something settle in his chest with the specific weight of things that had been worked for. It had been 11 months since the shareholders' meeting, 11 months of the investigation that had followed, of the slow institutional process of accountability that was never as fast or as satisfying as the moment you'd expected it to be. Forsyth had resigned in February, a quiet and undramatic exit negotiated by lawyers, the kind of departure that was technically voluntary in the way things were technically voluntary when the alternative was worse. Willard had followed in March, after the investigation formally confirmed what the documentation had shown. Holt had survived, having never quite crossed the line from complicity to conspiracy, and had spent the subsequent months being extremely cooperative, which Sienna described as performing remorse with professional efficiency, which Landon had found darkly funny. The media had moved on, which was what media did. The articles about Landon had been quietly updated in some cases, ignored in others. He'd never issued a public statement, never engaged with anyone who'd contacted him for comment, never done the thing people sometimes expected him to do, which was either defend himself loudly or crumble quietly. He'd gone to work, picked up his daughter, added too much salt to pasta, and let the record stand on its own merits. Mia had never seen the photographs. That was the one thing he'd held on to hardest, and it had held. The investigation's formal findings had been released in May. The narrative that Willard and Forsyth had constructed, the one that portrayed Sienna as emotionally compromised, distracted, unfit, had been officially characterized in the board's public statement as a coordinated effort to undermine leadership through deliberate misrepresentation. 7 words. Landon had read them in his car on a Tuesday morning and sat there for a moment before driving to work, thinking about how long it sometimes took for a true sentence to become a public one. Sienna had called him the morning the statement went out. She hadn't said much. They didn't need to say much anymore, about most things. But she'd said, "It's done." And there had been something in those 2 words that contained everything the previous year had cost, and everything it had been worth. "It's done," he'd said back. "Yeah. How do you feel?" A pause. "Like I can breathe all the way," she'd said. "I forgot what that felt like." He thought about that conversation sometimes in the months that followed, when life settled into the shape it was building toward. Not a grand shape, not a dramatic one, but a real one. The kind built from Tuesdays and Saturdays, from school pickups and soccer games and dinners that were sometimes oversalted, from the slow accumulation of ordinary things done in the same rooms with the same people until those rooms and those people became, without announcement, something you couldn't imagine not having. Sienna had a drawer at his apartment by April. Just one, which she'd mentioned needing on a Wednesday, and which he'd cleared out and pointed at without ceremony, and she'd put some things in it without ceremony, and neither of them had treated it as a milestone or a declaration because it wasn't either of those things. It was a drawer. It was practical, and the not making it into something was, in its own way, its own kind of statement. She came to dinner twice a week, usually. She attended Mia's soccer games with the same thermos of coffee and the same genuine investment in the outcomes, which Mia accepted as completely normal in the way children accepted things that had been consistent long enough. She and Mia had, over the year, developed their own specific dynamic that operated largely independent of Landon. A running disagreement about whether dolphins or whales were more intelligent that had apparently been ongoing since March, and showed no signs of resolution. A shared and slightly baffling enthusiasm for a British baking competition that they watched together on Saturday afternoons, while Landon did other things because he'd been excluded from the viewing sessions after making one comment about fondant that had been deemed insufficiently respectful. He found this deeply satisfying, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain and didn't try to. His sister Renata had met Sienna in the spring. Landon had been braced for the particular quality of attention Renata brought to people he cared about. Thorough, loving, and not always comfortable, but it had gone better than he'd expected, which was to say that within 40 minutes of meeting, Renata and Sienna had been in what appeared to be an entirely serious argument about urban zoning policy that had lasted through dinner and resolved itself over dessert with a declaration from Renata that Sienna was the first person Landon has ever been with who can hold a position under pressure, which is extremely important. "I'll take it," Sienna had said. "You should," Renata had said. "I don't give it often." He'd watched this from across the table and thought, this is what it looks like when the right things fit. The cafe was Mia's idea. They were walking along the waterfront on a Saturday in October. Overcast, seasonably cold, the kind of day that felt honest about what it was without trying to be anything else. And Mia had stopped in front of a cafe with a blue awning and said, "Isn't this the place?" Landon looked at the sign, the anchor. The little bell above the door was the same one. "Yeah," he said. "It is." "This is where you met," Mia said. This was not new information. She'd asked about it months ago in the specific way she sometimes circled back to things she'd been thinking about, and they told her a version of it that was accurate and age-appropriate. "Can we go in?" Landon looked at Sienna. Sienna looked at the cafe, then at him, with an expression that was slightly amused and slightly something else, harder to name. "Sure," Sienna said. They got a table. The same window booth was occupied by 2 college students with laptops, so they sat in the middle of the room instead, which was fine. Mia ordered hot chocolate with the authority of someone who knew what she wanted and wasn't taking questions. Landon ordered coffee. Sienna ordered tea, then looked at it when it arrived and said, "I keep doing this. I don't actually want tea." "Muscle memory," Landon said. "I ordered tea the first time we were here because I was cold and not thinking clearly," she said. "I know. I've ordered it every time since, apparently. You're a creature of habit. I'm a creature of stress responses," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She considered it. "Maybe not," she admitted. Mia was looking around the cafe with the absorbed interest she brought to new spaces, cataloging things, the exposed brick, the jazz coming from somewhere, the specials board above the counter. Then she looked at both of them. "What was it like?" she asked. "The first time." "Awkward," Landon said. "Very awkward," Sienna confirmed. "Because of the canal?" "Because of the canal, and because first meetings are generally awkward," Sienna said, "even when nobody's been in a canal." "Were you nervous?" "Very," Sienna said. Mia looked at Landon. "Were you?" "I almost left before she got here," he said. Mia looked at him with an expression that clearly communicated that this would have been an error of significant consequence. "Why?" "Because I hadn't done this in a long time," he said, "sitting in a cafe waiting for someone I didn't know." "What made you stay?" He thought about it. The honest answer was that he hadn't known at the time, had stayed out of some combination of stubbornness and not wanting to explain to Renata that he'd left before the person arrived. But that wasn't quite complete, either. He'd sat in that window booth watching the rain and thought once about what it meant to close yourself off from things, and whether there was a version of caution that was just another word for fear. "I was curious," he said. "About who was going to walk in?" Mia appeared to find this satisfactory. She turned to Sienna. "What about you?" "I was late," Sienna said, "and covered in mud, and I was fully prepared for him to take one look at me and decide he had better things to do. But he didn't." "He told me to sit down," Sienna said. "Which was—" She paused. "It was the right thing to do. Most people would have been polite and made an excuse." "Dad's not polite," Mia said, with complete affection. "Mia," Landon said. "I mean, you're honest," she said. "That's better than polite." Landon looked at his coffee. Sienna caught his eye over Mia's head, and her expression did the thing it sometimes did. The crooked half-smile that still sometimes arrived without her full permission, the one he'd first seen in this room 14 months ago. He thought, "I almost left. 5 seconds earlier, and I would have been in my car." He didn't say it out loud. Some things you held privately, not because they were secret, but because they were yours, and the weight of them was part of what made them matter. No. He proposed on a Sunday afternoon in November. It was not a planned thing, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it. He had thought about it, had been thinking about it for months, in the tentative back-and-forth way you thought about things when you were someone who had learned to be careful with certainty. He'd looked at rings once, briefly, online, and then felt premature about it and closed the browser. He'd talked to Renata about it in September, a short and characteristically direct conversation in which she'd said, "Do you want to?" And he'd said yes, and she'd said, "Then stop thinking about the timing and do it." And he'd said he needed to find the right moment, and she'd said the right moment was a story people told themselves to avoid doing things, and he'd hung up and thought about it for another 2 months. What happened in the end was this. They were at his apartment, a Sunday, Mia at a birthday party for 4 hours. He and Sienna had spent the first hour doing the things you did when you unexpectedly had an empty house. Nothing particularly significant, just the quiet domestic things that were underrated in their own right. She'd been reading on the couch. He'd been at the table looking at something for work. The radiator had been making its noise. The afternoon light had that specific November quality, pale and sideways, coming through the windows and catching dust and making everything in the room look like it was inside something amber. He'd looked up at her on the couch, reading, her feet tucked under her, the $60 secondhand sweater, her hair loose in the way it only was when she wasn't anywhere she needed to perform anything. And he thought, this is the thing, not a peak moment, not a crescendo. Just this. A Sunday afternoon, the radiator, the light. Her reading on his couch like it was a thing she'd always done. He got up. He went to the bedroom and opened the box he'd bought 3 weeks ago and then felt premature about and put in the back of the sock drawer. He came back to the living room and sat on the coffee table in front of her, which was close enough that she looked up from her book. She registered the box immediately. Her eyes moved from it to his face. "Landon," she said. "I've been thinking about how to do this for months," he said. "I kept looking for the right moment, and Renata told me that was a way of avoiding it, and I think she was right." He paused. "So this is just a Sunday, and I love you, and I've loved you for a long time, and I want the Sundays to be ours." She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen precisely before. Not the composure, not the armor, not even the version of her that had stood in a boardroom and said the difficult true thing. Something more stripped than all of that. "All of them?" she said. "All of them." She looked at the box for a long moment. He could see her breathing. "We're imperfect people," she said, quietly, like she needed to say it. "Extremely," he agreed. "We're going to be bad at things. Frequently. I work too much. I have a company that's going to keep demanding things from me, and there are going to be periods at— Sienna." He waited until she looked at him. "I know. I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the book. She'd bent the page, which was the only time he'd ever seen her do that, which told him something about the state of her. And she said quietly and completely, "Yes." He opened the box. The ring was simple, deliberately sewn. He'd chosen it for that because she was someone who wore a $60 sweater when she wasn't working and who had never in 14 months wanted anything from him that cost more than his attention. She held out her hand, which was steady, and he put it on her finger, and it fit because he'd asked Delphine for her ring size 3 weeks ago, and Delphine had provided it without a single question, which he deeply respected. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked up at him. "Delphine," she said, "obviously." "She didn't tell me. I asked her not to. She's going to be insufferable about this." "Probably," he said. "You can fire her." "I can't fire Delphine." Sienna looked at the ring again, then back at him. "She saved my company." "She did," he agreed. "Good thing you have other ways to express gratitude." Sienna laughed. The real one, the sudden one, the one that still arrived like it had decided to happen before she could weigh in on it. And she leaned forward and put her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a minute, not saying anything, in the November light, in the quiet apartment, 4 hours before Mia came home. He told Mia that evening, after she'd come back from the party with frosting on her jacket, and a sugar-fueled velocity that took about 40 minutes to run itself down. She was on the couch in her pajamas, the momentum finally spent, when he sat next to her and told her. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Sienna, who was in the armchair across the room with a careful expression, waiting. "So she'll live here?" Mia said. "We'd figure that out together," Landon said. "With us?" "That's the idea." Mia looked at Sienna. "Your apartment doesn't have enough drawings on the refrigerator," she said. "That's true," Sienna said. "It doesn't. I can fix that." "I know you can." Mia appeared to run some private internal calculation, then nodded once with the gravity of a board vote. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Landon said. "Yes, okay." She pulled her blanket up with the air of someone who had rendered a decision and considered the matter settled. "Can I have a dog?" "Absolutely not," Landon said. "I'll ask Sienna." "Sienna will also say no." "Will she?" He looked at Sienna. Sienna was looking at the ceiling. "Sienna," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "You're not thinking." "I might be thinking." "Sienna." She looked at Mia. Mia looked back at her with enormous, perfectly calibrated eyes. "We'll revisit the dog conversation in 6 months," Sienna said. "That means yes," Mia told Landon. "That means no," he said. In 6 months, Sienna said, which resolved nothing, and both of them knew it. Mia smiled and burrowed into her blanket with the satisfaction of someone who had won the thing that mattered most and was willing to be patient about the rest. There is a version of this story that would have you believe it was fate, that two people were always going to find each other, that the canal and the rain and the borrowed flip-flops were chapters in something written before either of them arrived. It's a comforting version. It makes the hard parts feel purposeful and the coincidences feel like design. Landon didn't believe in that version. What he believed, having lived inside the actual thing, was messier and truer, that two people had made a long series of small choices, to stay in the cafe, to ask the question, to call instead of not calling, to step toward instead of away, and that the accumulation of those choices, not any single destined moment, was what had built the thing they now lived inside. He thought about this on a Wednesday morning in February, almost a year after the proposal, standing in the kitchen of the house they'd moved into together 3 months earlier. A house. Actual house. With a yard and enough bedrooms and a refrigerator that was currently covered in 26 drawings, because Mia had accepted the new space as a fresh canvas and proceeded accordingly. The house was in a neighborhood 10 minutes from Mia's school. It had a porch, which Sienna had specifically wanted, and a workspace in the converted garage where Landon was slowly taking some of the certification courses he'd been putting off for 5 years, moving toward the teaching credential he'd mentioned to Sienna once, almost in passing, 14 months ago, and which she'd said nothing dramatic about except, "When are you starting?" which had been, characteristically, exactly the right thing to say. The company was stable. The investigation had fully resolved in the summer. Formal findings, formal consequences, the governance structure rebuilt on ground that had been cleared of what had been growing in it. Delphine had described the outcome as better than we had any right to expect, which from Delphine was something close to euphoric. Sienna worked long hours still, would probably always work long hours because the company was hers in the specific way that some things belong to people. Not because of ownership, but because of what it had cost to build it and what it represented. But she came home now. That was the different thing. She came home to a refrigerator full of drawings and an oversalted dinner and a child who had opinions about everything and a man who asked dumb questions that sometimes turned out not to be dumb. And she came home to all of it with the expression he'd first seen in a car on a December evening going to pick up Mia from school. Open, unguarded, present. They'd gotten married in April. Small, on purpose. The waterfront, a gray afternoon that had threatened rain and then held off. 15 people who mattered. Renata had cried, which she would dispute if asked. Delphine had not cried, but had stood in the back with an expression of profound self-satisfaction that she didn't bother to conceal. Mia had worn a dress she'd picked herself, deep blue with a pattern that she described as sophisticated, and had stood between them during the ceremony with the solemnity of someone who understood the weight of the occasion and was taking her responsibilities as witness seriously. The officiant had said the things officiants said, the good version of them, and Landon had looked at Sienna and thought about the cafe and the borrowed flip-flops and the scratch on her forearm, and his name was Oliver, and a parking garage in December, and a drawer in April, and a Sunday afternoon in November light, and he had thought, all of it. I would do all of it again. He'd said the words when it was his turn, and she'd said hers, and Mia had handed over the rings at the exact right moment with the exact right gravity, and it had been imperfect in all the ways real things were imperfect. Someone's chair had scraped loudly at a quiet moment. Landon had stumbled over a word and recovered. Sienna had gripped his hands harder than necessary and probably didn't know she was doing it. And none of it had mattered, because the realness was the point, and they'd had enough of the performance version of things to know the difference. What Landon had learned in the 2 years since a woman arrived at his table soaking wet and barefoot and already apologizing was this: that second chances were not really second chances, that framing implied you'd had a first chance and failed it, and that this new thing was a corrective, a retrial, a grace extended to someone who'd earned a second look. That wasn't what this had been. This had been a first chance at something he'd never actually had. Not a retry of his marriage, not a better version of what had come before, but a genuinely different thing, a thing that asked different things from him and gave different things back. Lauren had not been a mistake he was correcting. She had been a person who had known, before he did, that they were building in the wrong direction, and the courage of that knowledge, however painful the way she'd acted on it, had set him on the road that led to a cafe in October and a woman in borrowed flip-flops who had arrived soaked from a canal, ready to explain herself to a stranger, and had stayed. He'd thought for a long time that the life he'd built after Lauren, the careful, bounded, deliberate single-father life, was what he was, that the smallness of it was a choice and not a constriction. He hadn't been entirely wrong. The life had been good. The routines had been good. Mia had been raised in a structure that had given her the floor she stood on, the confidence that it would hold, but he had been half living. That was the honest truth, the one he could say now from the other side of it. He had been maintaining rather than inhabiting. He had kept everything in the range where it couldn't hurt him, and things that couldn't hurt you also couldn't reach you all the way, and he had been, quietly and without drama, less alive than he was capable of being. Sienna had not fixed this. That was the other thing he'd learned, the more important thing. She hadn't come into his life and repaired something broken. She'd arrived at a table where he'd been sitting with a wall around him, and she'd been so completely and impractically herself, muddy, bleeding slightly, in borrowed shoes already honest, that the wall had simply become insufficient, not knocked down, just insufficient. Unable to do the job it had been built for in the presence of something that didn't recognize it. And he'd had to choose. That was the part that got lost in the story when you told it simply. The part where nothing had been automatic, nothing had been swept along. At every point where the cost had gone up, the Wired magazine, the media, the photographs of Mia, the 4 days of silence, he had chosen. Scared, imperfect, not entirely sure, the way you chose real things. He had stayed and chosen and stayed again, and so had she, and that staying was the love story, not the rain and the canal and the first date charm of it. The love story was every time you looked at the exit and decided not to take it. He thought about Mia saying, "I told you about the salt," and Sienna ordering tea she didn't want because her hands remembered being cold 14 months ago, and 26 drawings on a refrigerator in a house that had a porch. And he thought, this is what second chances actually look like. Not a grand reset, just showing up again and making the choice again, for as long as you're given. On a Thursday morning in February, 6 months after the wedding, Sienna came into the kitchen where he was making coffee and set her phone down on the counter with a particular expression. He looked at her. "What?" "Nothing bad," she said quickly. "Just Oliver." He frowned. It took him a second. "The kid from the canal?" "His mother she'd been following up, periodically, through the company's communications team because she didn't have my direct contact." Sienna looked at the phone. "He's 7 now. He started 2nd grade." She paused. "She sent a photograph." He looked at the phone. A school photograph, the kind with the blue background, of a boy with a gap in his front teeth and a slightly too large collar and an expression of complete confidence. Oliver. His name was Oliver. That's what his mother kept saying. Oliver, Oliver, Oliver. He stood there for a moment with the coffee still in his hand. "He looks like a handful," he said. "He does," Sienna said. "Good." She picked the phone up and looked at the photograph for another moment, then set it face down on the counter in the way she did when she wanted to hold something privately. He watched her turn back toward the window, the February light on her face, and he thought about a woman jumping down into a flooded canal in an $1,100 blazer because there was a child in the water, and she was the person who was there. And he thought about how that was who she had always been, underneath everything, the company and the armor and the composure. Just a person who did the thing that needed doing because someone had to. He'd fallen in love with that person, specifically. Not the CEO on the magazine cover, not the $3.2 billion, or the board and the strategy and the war she'd won for what she'd built. The woman who showed up at a table soaking wet with a story about a kid named Oliver and who'd carried that name gently in her voice all the way through the months that came after. "You should write back," he said, to his mother. "I did," she said, "last night." She turned from the window. "I told her he looked like a kid who knew where he was going." "Does that show in a school photograph?" "It showed in his," she said. "Trust me." He handed her the coffee he'd made, which was hers. He'd made hers first, which had become an automatic thing so long ago he couldn't remember deciding to do it. She took it without comment, which was its own kind of language, the kind that accumulated over years. Mia came out of her room at 7:15 in the particular condition of her mornings, wild-haired, determined, already talking before she'd fully cleared the doorway. "There's a soccer thing," she announced. "Saturday. Can both of you come?" "What time?" Landon said. 9. "I have a call at 9:30, Sienna said. "It'll be done by 9:30, Mia said. "Probably, maybe 9:45. "Mia." 9:45, Mia said firmly. "Definitely by 9:45. Sienna looked at Landon. Landon looked at Sienna. The familiar negotiation of a schedule, the ordinary machinery of a life shared with a child who treated all adult commitments as provisional in the face of soccer. "I'll move the call," Sienna said. Mia accepted this as her due and went to the refrigerator, where she stood for a moment surveying the drawings. 26 of them, mostly marine life, 2 horses, one extremely ambitious attempt at a city skyline, before opening the door and pulling out the orange juice. Landon stood in the kitchen in the February morning, the radiator making its noise, the coffee getting warm in his hands, and he thought about the things that had led here. Not with sentimentality, not with the clean emotional resolution that stories sometimes tried to apply to lives that didn't work that way. The hard parts had been genuinely hard. The photographs of Mia were still something he felt when he let himself think about them. The 4 days of silence had cost something he'd gotten back but couldn't fully reclaim. The investigation had taken most of a year from both of them, in ways that showed up in small exhaustions, in evenings when one of them needed quiet and the other needed to talk, and they had to figure out how to give each other what was needed, even when it was different things. Marriage was going to ask more of both of them. He knew that. There would be seasons when the company demanded things from Sienna that left less of her for home, and he would have to hold more and say less about it, and he would not always do it gracefully. There would be seasons when Mia's particular intensity overwhelmed the household, and Sienna, who had grown up an only child in a quiet apartment, would need more space than the house currently offered, and they would have to learn the language for that. There would be arguments. They'd already had some, real ones, the kind where you said something you'd wished you'd phrased differently. And the arguments would get easier to resolve, probably, with practice, the way most things did. He knew all of this. He wasn't standing in his kitchen with rose-colored anything. He was standing in his kitchen with coffee and a 7-year-old holding the orange juice and the woman he'd married looking at a photograph of a boy named Oliver in the February light, and the knowing of what it would cost didn't make him want it less. That was the thing. That was the actual thing. The thing he'd spent the years before this living without knowing he was missing it. Wanting something enough that the cost didn't make you want to put it down. Being all the way in instead of managing the distance. He had been careful for a long time. Careful was not bad. Careful had raised a child who knew the floor would hold. But careful, alone, was not a life. It was a waiting room. He was done waiting. Mia poured her orange juice, spilled a small amount on the counter, said oops without particular remorse, and climbed onto the counter stool. Sienna wiped the spill with the dish towel that lived next to the sink, without comment, without making a production of it. Landon started making toast because it was Thursday, and on Thursdays Mia wanted toast, and the kitchen was warm and a little loud with the radiator and the toaster, and Mia's running commentary about the soccer thing on Saturday and whether the other team had a fast left midfielder. And outside the window, the city was doing its ordinary morning thing, and none of it was exceptional, and all of it was his. He thought once more about a cafe in October and a woman who had showed up late and soaking and had stood at the edge of his table with a story she owed him, and steady hands, and a voice that didn't apologize for itself. He thought about what would have happened if he'd been 5 seconds faster. He thought, I would have missed everything, not just the good parts. Everything, the hard parts and the difficult seasons and the arguments about things that weren't worth arguing about and the 4 days of silence and all of it, the whole weight of a real life shared with a real person. He would have missed it. He had not missed it. The toast came up. He put it on a plate. He handed it to Mia, who said thank you in the absent way of someone thinking about left midfielders. And Sienna looked up from her coffee and caught his eye across the kitchen, and she smiled. The real one, the crooked one, the one that still arrived a little before she'd decided to let it. He smiled back. The morning went on.